Hey there, tonight we're diving into the gritty chaos of a medieval siege, where the truth is your biggest battle might just be with a rat-infested trench rather than a gallant knight. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now settle in, maybe turn on some white noise or grab your favorite blanket, and let's drift into tonight's story together. The first thing that hits you isn't the sound of clashing swords or the cries of brave defenders. It's the smell. Let's be honest, the aromas of a medieval town under siege are not exactly Chanel No. 5. It's more like a pungent cocktail of fear, unwashed bodies, and the unfortunate, ever-present stench of refuse. Welcome to your morning in a medieval siege, where the only thing more prevalent than the smell of desperation is the lack of a decent shower. Waking up, you might be tempted to splash your face with water to shake off the night's unease. Good luck with that. Fresh water is about as rare as a unicorn around here. In the grim reality of medieval life, clean water is the ultimate luxury. It's not like you can just turn on a tap or order a Brita filter on Amazon. In fact, the closest you'll get to fresh water is the murky stuff carted in from outside the walls, assuming it hasn't been tainted by the besiegers. And let's not forget those lovely chamber pots that get emptied into the street. Hygienic, right, but let's say you finally manage to drag yourself out of bed, ready to tackle the day. If you're thinking a hearty breakfast is on the agenda, think again. Food is scarce and prices skyrocketing. We're talking inflation rates that would make a modern economist weep. The cost of grain could easily triple or quadruple during a siege. Bread, if you can find it, is probably stale enough to double as a weapon. Meat. The livestock was either eaten months ago or is being rationed so tightly that a single chicken leg might cost you a week's wages. And speaking of wages, don't expect your coin to go far. The economy in a besieged town is a disaster zone. Merchants are either hoarding their goods or selling them at prices that make you question your life choices. You might need to barter your last pair of shoes for a handful of beans. Who needs footwear when you've got an empty stomach, right? Now, let's talk about those heroic defenders you might have seen in movies. You know, the ones clad in shining armor, making noble speeches. Yeah, they're mostly a romanticized myth. Sure, there are some well-trained knights and soldiers, but many of the town's defenders are just regular folks handed a weapon and told to do their best. And while their spirit might be commendable, the living conditions are far from it. Imagine cramming a bunch of stressed, hungry, and sleep-deprived people into cramped quarters. It's like the worst camping trip ever, minus the campfire songs and s'mores. The psychological strain of living under constant threat is no joke. You're always on edge, wondering if today's the day the enemy breaches the walls or if starvation will get you first. It's a high-stakes game of survival, and there's no timeout to catch your breath. The constant bombardment of fear and anxiety is enough to wear down even the most resilient souls. And let's not forget the delightful presence of disease, which loves to make an appearance in these unsanitary conditions. With everyone packed together like sardines, illnesses spread faster than gossip in a medieval court. If the enemy doesn't get you, a nice bout of dysentery just might. So, as you start your day under siege, take a moment to appreciate the modern conveniences we often take for granted. The simple luxury of a hot shower, a stable economy, and a breakfast that doesn't involve bargaining your earthly possessions. It's easy to romanticize the past, but living through a siege is a stark reminder that sometimes nostalgia is best left in the history books. As you ponder the comforts of modern life, the morning silence is shattered by a distant, earth-shaking thud. That, my friend, is the sound of a trebuchet in action, a medieval engineering marvel that makes a catapult look like a slingshot. These behemoths weren't just built for show. They were the ancient world's answer to heavy artillery, capable of hurling 90-kilogram stones over 300 meters. Forget those romanticized images of knights clashing swords on horseback. The real business of medieval warfare was about who could lob the biggest rock the furthest. Constructing a trebuchet was no small feat. We're talking about months of labor, hundreds of skilled workers, and a price tag that could make a king clutch his crown. A single trebuchet could cost upwards of £30 sterling in the 13th century, which in today's money is the kind of cash that could buy you a small island, or at least a very fancy yacht. This was serious investment territory, and not just anyone could afford to build one. While the trebuchet was busy rewriting the landscape, the siege tower loomed large on the horizon, literally. These towering wooden structures, sometimes reaching heights of 40 feet, were rolling fortresses designed to breach castle walls. Imagine the medieval version of a tank, slowly inching its way forward, laden with soldiers ready to spill over the battlements like ants at a picnic. But these towers weren't just slapped together with a few planks and a prayer. Constructing a siege tower was a logistical nightmare involving hundreds of trees, skilled carpenters, and a workforce of labourers who probably didn't sign up for this sort of home renovation project. A single tower could take weeks to build, and if the besieged defenders were particularly savvy, they'd be setting it ablaze before it even got close. Fire arrows, anyone. Speaking of defenders, let's talk about those heroic knights you've seen galloping across screens in shining armor. Spoiler alert, most of them didn't spend their days charging valiantly into battle. In reality, the knightly charge was often the last resort, a desperate attempt to break a siege that had already dragged on for weeks or even months. Knights were expensive assets, not expendable pawns, and losing one to a well-placed arrow was not on anyone's to-do list. The real work of defending a castle was less about dashing heroics and more about the drudgery of logistics. It was all about stockpiling supplies, ensuring the walls were reinforced, and keeping morale high among a populace that was one bad day away from mutiny. Siege warfare was a game of patience, where the real winners were those who could outlast their opponents without starving to death or succumbing to disease. And let's not forget the political chess game unfolding behind the scenes. The besiegers and defenders weren't just hurling rocks and insults. They were also negotiating, plotting, and sometimes even swapping sides for the right price. Loyalties could be as fickle as the wind, and a well-timed bribe or promise of land could turn enemies into allies faster than you can say, Game of Thrones. Sieges were as much about psychological warfare as they were about physical combat. The besiegers would often employ tricks to demoralize the defenders, such as displaying captured soldiers or launching diseased animals over the walls. It was a brutal reminder that in war, the mind could be as potent a battlefield as the ground beneath your feet. As the day wears on, the distant rumble of siege engines becomes a monotonous backdrop to a medieval soap opera of intrigue and endurance. The besieged must weigh the risk of holding out against the hope of relief from a friendly army, while the besiegers calculate how long their supplies will last, and whether their investment in this drawn-out affair will pay dividends. In this high-stakes game, there are no guarantees of glory, only the harsh reality that in the medieval world, survival was often the best kind of victory. The legends might tell tales of valor and honor, but the truth was messier, dirtier, and infinitely more human. So, as you stand at the ramparts, watching the day unfold with siege towers looming ever closer, remember, in the grand chessboard of history, every move counted, and the stakes were as high as the towers themselves. And as you watch those towers inch forward, let's pivot from the battlefield to the bustling chaos inside the besieged town. It's here that the real human drama unfolds, more gripping than any medieval soap opera. You see, while the outer walls might be under constant threat, the true siege is happening within, where social divides are as wide as the moat surrounding the castle. Welcome to the great medieval class divide, folks, where nobles and commoners are about as friendly as cats and dogs. The noble class, perched high in their stone keeps, are the medieval version of those folks hoarding toilet paper during a pandemic. They've got the resources, the food, and the wine. Let's not forget the wine. and they're not exactly in a sharing mood. It's a classic case of, I've got mine, good luck with yours. The common folk, meanwhile, are left to scrape by on whatever crumbs fall from the lord's tables. Those fancy banquets you've seen in movies. More like a distant dream for the average townsperson who's lucky to get a bowl of thin gruel. And if you're thinking, well, surely the nobles look out for their people, think again. Nobles were more concerned with keeping their own stomachs full and their own hides intact. But don't let the nobles, posh lifestyles, fool you into thinking they're living it up like medieval Kardashians. The paranoia runs high when you're sitting on a pile of hoarded goods. Every knock at the door could be a desperate commoner, or worse, a fellow noble with a dagger and a grudge. After all, keeping your head was as much a challenge as keeping your bread. And speaking of bread, let's talk economics. Siege inflation doesn't just make economists weep, it makes them wail and gnash their teeth. The price of grain. Astronomical. We're talking about a loaf of bread that could cost a day's wages. So, unless you're on Team Noble, you're probably making some hard choices between bread and, well, anything else. It's a brutal reminder that in times of scarcity, the gap between the haves and the have-nots isn't just a chasm, it's a canyon. Now, nestled within this social maelstrom is the surprising power of medieval propaganda. That's right, folks, spin doctors were a thing long before cable news. Both sides of the siege were hard at work, crafting narratives to keep morale from plummeting into the abyss. On the inside, town criers would spread tales of heroic last stands and imminent rescue, painting a picture of hope even as the walls threatened to crumble. Outside, the besiegers might spread rumors of impending doom or claim divine favor to shake the defenders' resolve. These tales were more than just words. They were lifelines in a world where despair could be as deadly as any sword. The besieged needed to believe that relief was just around the corner, while the besiegers needed their troops confident that the castle gates would soon swing open. It was a battle for hearts and minds, fought with as much cunning as any sword fight. But let's shatter another romantic myth while we're at it, the idea of the unyielding fortress. Picture the mighty castle, standing firm in the face of overwhelming odds, unbending, unbroken. Sounds inspiring, right? Reality check. Fortresses were about as unyielding as a wet paper bag once treachery and bribery entered the equation. In fact, many sieges ended not with a glorious last stand, but with a quiet betrayal or a well-placed bribe. Espionage was the medieval equivalent of a get-rich-quick scheme, and there was always someone willing to sell out their comrades for the right price. A well-timed bribe could open gates faster than any battering ram, turning besieged defenders into unexpected allies. It's a harsh reminder that loyalty was often negotiable, and the highest bidder usually won. And if you think espionage was just a cloak and dagger affair, think again. Spies were everywhere, from the lowly servant carrying messages to the disgruntled noble looking to climb the social ladder. Betrayal wasn't just an option. It was practically a career path. Forget the knights and their flashy armor. These were the real movers and shakers, the ones who could change the course of a siege with a whispered word or a slip of parchment. So, as noon approaches and the sun beats down on a town teetering on the brink, remember that the medieval siege was as much about human nature as it was about military might. It was a time when survival often depended more on cunning and guile than on brute strength. And while the legends might tell tales of unbreakable fortresses and noble last stands, the truth was far more complex, tangled in webs of deceit and desperation. In this medieval chess game, every piece had its price, and the most valuable currency wasn't coin or grain, but loyalty. And that, my friends, was always in short supply. As you navigate the cramped, tension-filled streets of this besieged town, keep an eye on your neighbors and your back. After all, in a world where alliances shift like sand, the real enemy might be closer than you think. Stay tuned, because the drama is just getting started. Afternoon rolls in, and just as the sun hits its zenith, the day's real work begins. Forget medieval knights galloping into the sunset. It's time to roll up those sleeves and get dirty, literally. Welcome to the grim, unglamorous world of reinforcing defenses and rationing supplies, a daily grind in the life of a besieged medieval town. Let's drag you to the forefront where the unsung heroes, the engineers and labourers, are the real rock stars. These folks are the medieval equivalent of today's frontline workers, patching up walls, repairing weapons, and generally holding the fort, quite literally. Their tools, think hammers, nails, and wooden beams. It's not exactly a home depot run, but it's close enough. These professionals were the backbone of any successful defense, mending breaches faster than you can say siege warfare. And speaking of breaches, let's talk about the economic black hole a prolonged siege opens up. Forget about the cost of living. We're talking about the cost of surviving. Take the siege of Orleans during the 100 Years' War, for instance. It dragged on for months in 1428-1429. The financial toll, catastrophic. Supplies dwindled, and the town's economy evaporated faster than a medieval ale in a thirsty tavern. The aftermath saw a generation struggling to recover as resources had been sucked dry and infrastructure laid to waste. Rationing became the norm, with each morsel of food guarded like gold. Picture this, a loaf of bread costing a small fortune and a handful of grain being worth its weight in well itself. The longer a siege dragged on, the more these prices climbed, ascending to heights that even the most daring mountaineer would balk at. Sure, the nobles might have squirreled away some reserves, but for the average Joe or Joan, it was a daily exercise in grim calculus. Eat today or save for an even hungrier tomorrow. But let's not be too quick to dismiss the ingenuity born out of desperation. Just like a modern-day hackathon, these townspeople got creative. Ersatz foods became a thing. Imagine turning sawdust into bread or shoe leather into makeshift stew. Our ancestors were nothing if not resourceful, and necessity truly was the mother of some rather dubious culinary inventions. Now, while the townsfolk were busy turning their kitchens into medieval chemistry labs, the defenders on the walls were grappling with another harsh reality, the concept of honor. Our honor, the romanticized notion that in the face of adversity, humans rise to their noblest selves. In reality, it was more often a matter of pragmatism. When faced with the prospect of annihilation, honor frequently took a backseat to survival. Take the siege of Château-Gaillard in 1204. The defenders, running low on options, resorted to desperate measures. They disguised themselves as peasants to slip out and forage for supplies, returning under the cover of night. It was a move straight out of a spy novel, but it was less about gallantry and more about not starving to death. And let's not forget the last-ditch negotiations that often decided the fate of many a fortress. These weren't your epic showdowns. They were quiet affairs, hushed whispers in dimly lit chambers, where terms were hashed out with all the ceremony of a backroom poker game. Sometimes it was as simple as handing over the keys in exchange for safe passage. Not exactly the stuff of legends, but hey, when the alternative is getting catapulted into oblivion, you take what you can get. Even the concept of medieval honor was sometimes a facade for political maneuvering. Take the Siege of Acre during the Third Crusade, an epic, drawn-out affair from 1189 to 1191. The defenders eventually surrendered, not because they were out of fight, but because they were out of options. Negotiations, deception, and a heavy dose of reality sealed their fate, overshadowing any notions of chivalric glory. In the grand tapestry of medieval sieges, it turns out that honor was often as negotiable as a vendor's price at a medieval market. Beneath the tales of gallantry and valor lay a messy human story, one of survival, adaptation, and the occasional well-timed bribe. So, as the afternoon sun dips lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the weary defenders and the strained townsfolk, remember that the myth of the romantic medieval siege is just that, a myth. The truth is a complex web of hardships, desperate strategies, and a constant dance with the spectre of defeat. In this high-stakes game, those who survived weren't always the bravest or the boldest, but often the most cunning, the most adaptable, and the most willing to face the harsh realities of their world. And as the day turns to evening, the siege continues unabated. Tomorrow will bring more challenges, more tests of endurance, and more opportunities for those within the besieged walls to prove that, even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can find a way, though sometimes not quite as nobly as the songs would have you believe. Stay tuned, because the castle walls may hold firm, but the story is far from over. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows over the medieval tableau of hardship and hope, let's dive into what happens when the worst-case scenario becomes your reality. Injury amidst a siege. If you thought the morning was rough, welcome to the evening's grim reality, where medieval medical practices make even modern dentist visits seem like a day at the spa. First off, let's confront the terrifying truth about healthcare back then. Spoiler alert. The local barber doubling as a surgeon isn't just a stereotype, it's a grim reality. Those barber poles with the red and white stripes. Yeah, they're not just about haircuts. They symbolize blood and bandages. So, if you were unlucky enough to take an arrow to the knee, you weren't exactly in for a quick recovery. You were more likely to encounter a barber surgeon who preferred leeches over anesthesia and believed bloodletting was the cure-all for everything from a headache to a hangnail. Speaking of leeches, these little bloodsuckers were the medieval equivalent of a multi-tool. Got a fever, leeches. Wound infection, more leeches. They were the duct tape of medieval medicine, despite their dubious effectiveness. And while we're on the subject of infections, let's talk about antiseptic, or the lack thereof. With hygiene standards that would make your average teenager's bedroom look like an operating room, wounds often festered faster than gossip in a court scandal. In fact, the chances of dying from infection were alarmingly high, and even a minor cut could spiral into a life-threatening condition. Now, let's add a dash of economic context to this medical mess. The cost of treatment during a siege could be astronomical, assuming you could even find someone with enough medical knowledge to patch you up. The Black Death in the 14th century wiped out about 30–60% of Europe's population, and while this particular plague isn't directly tied to sieges, it illustrates just how precarious life was in these times. The scarcity of trained professionals meant that even basic care was often out of reach for the average person. If you were a peasant, your best chance at survival might involve a prayer and a poultice, rather than a physician. As night falls and the fires in the besieged town glow like stars in a grim constellation, we have to pause and reflect on the resilience of these communities. Despite the hardships, there was an undeniable strength in their ability to endure. Siege or not, life went on. People found ways to adapt to survive, to continue their lives amidst chaos. It was this resilience, born from necessity, that fueled incredible ingenuity. From crafting makeshift weapons to devising clever ways to communicate with allies outside the walls, the besieged often turned desperation into a catalyst for creativity. Take, for example, the siege of Leiden during the 80 Years' War in 1573–1574. The Dutch cut the dikes and flooded their own land to drive out the besieging Spanish forces. Talk about turning the tide, literally. It was a bold, risky move that ultimately paid off, demonstrating how far people were willing to go to protect their homes. But why, despite all these stark realities, does the myth of the noble siege persist? Why do we cling to these romanticized notions of honor and valor? Perhaps it's because these stories offer a comforting narrative, a way to impose order on the chaos of history. We long for tales of heroism, of good triumphing over evil, even when the truth is far more complex and untidy. The lasting impact of medieval sieges is undeniable, shaping military strategy and urban planning for centuries. The techniques honed during these sieges laid the groundwork for modern warfare. The idea of surrounding an enemy, cutting off supplies, and waiting for them to surrender has echoes in the blockades and sieges of modern times. And those formidable castle walls, they evolved into the complex fortifications of later centuries, influencing everything from the star forts of the Renaissance to the bunkers of World War II. Urban planning, too, bears the marks of siege warfare. The winding streets of medieval towns were not just charming, They were strategic, designed to confuse invaders and protect the inhabitants. The walls that once defended against siege engines now serve as historical landmarks, a testament to a city's resilience and a reminder of its tumultuous past. So, as you close the book on your exhausting day in a medieval siege, take a moment to appreciate the harsh realities and the enduring human spirit that turned adversity into innovation. The romantic tales may live on, but it's the gritty truth that offers the most valuable lessons. From the depths of despair, people found ways to survive, adapt, and even thrive. And in doing so, they left a legacy that continues to shape our world today. As the night deepens and the fires flicker out, let that be the final takeaway from your time in the trenches of history. The year is 618, and China's political scene is about as stable as a Jenga tower in an earthquake. The Sui dynasty's collapse has left the empire in shambles, with chaos reigning supreme and opportunistic leaders circling like sharks in bloodied waters. This was a time when the throne seemed more like a revolving door at a department store during Black Friday. Enter Li Yuan, a man with an eye for opportunity and a knack for seizing the moment, like spotting a dollar bill on a windy day. Li Yuan wasn't just some random dude off the street. He was a savvy aristocrat with a pedigree to match his ambition. A former Sui general, he knew firsthand how disastrously the previous dynasty had been mismanaged. The Sui emperors had spent so much on extravagant projects, like the Grand Canal, which stretched over 1,100 miles, that they might as well have been burning cash in the courtyard. And let's not forget the military campaigns that were as ill-fated as trying to teach a cat to fetch. The weight of these blunders was too much for the Sui to bear, which is why they crumbled faster than a stale cookie under pressure. In the spring of 617, Li Yuan saw his golden ticket. The Sui Emperor Yangdi was busy dodging his own demise, hiding out in Jiangdu while the rest of the country fell apart like a bad soap opera. Li Yuan, with the political finesse of a chess grandmaster, gathered a coalition of disgruntled nobles and military commanders, all ready to bet on a new dynasty. And thus began his rebellion, which was less about noble ideals and more about the pragmatic reality of power vacuums and survival of the fittest. By November 617, Li Yuan had captured the Sui capital, Chang'an, a city that had seen more coups and counter-coups than a season of Game of Thrones. He declared himself the Prince of Tang, a title that at the time probably sounded like a fun side gig, but soon became the stepping stone to emperor. Fast forward to June 618, and Li Yuan officially founded the Tang dynasty, stepping into the emperor's shoes with a mixture of confidence and the awareness that one wrong move could send him packing. The inauguration of the Tang dynasty wasn't just another line in the history books. It marked the beginning of an era that would see China become a cultural and economic powerhouse. Li Yuan's ascent was a masterclass in political maneuvering. Imagine a game of musical chairs, but instead of sitting down when the music stops, the players are trying to seize the throne, often with a sword in hand. His success lay in knowing when to play nice and when to bring out the big guns, literally. He capitalized on the Sui's missteps, turning public discontent into a rallying cry for something new. The Sui were out, and the Tang were in, thanks to a combination of military prowess, strategic alliances, and a bit of good old-fashioned luck. But founding a dynasty is one thing, making it stick is another. Li Yuan understood that to cement his family's rule, he needed to be more than just a conqueror. He had to be a unifier, a stabilizer, and most importantly, a ruler who could keep the lid on the simmering pot of rebellion that was the Chinese Empire. His reign, although short, he abdicated in favor of his son in 626, laid the groundwork for what would become one of China's most celebrated periods. The Tang dynasty was off to a start that was as promising as it was precarious, a delicate balancing act of ambition, strategy, and the very human tendency to seek power wherever it seemed to falter. As Li Yuan set about organizing his new regime, the empire he inherited was a patchwork of provinces, each with its own power struggles and simmering dissent. His job was to weave this tapestry into a coherent whole, all while keeping an eye on those who might want to pull the threads apart. It was a task that required not just a sword, but a scalpel, deft political acumen, and a willingness to make tough choices, like any good leader trying to hold together a kingdom on the brink of greatness or disaster. The Tang dynasty's early years were a time of rebuilding and reformation, a chance to learn from the Sui's mistakes and forge a new path. This wasn't just about patching holes. It was about laying a foundation that could withstand the test of time and the inevitable challenges of ruling an empire as vast and diverse as China. Li Yuan's legacy was the groundwork he laid, the initial thrust of what would become one of history's most remarkable dynasties. His story is a reminder that in the Game of Thrones, it's not just about taking power. It's about knowing what to do with it once you have it. And so, the Tang dynasty began its journey, a beacon of potential and possibility set against a backdrop of chaos and uncertainty. Just as Li Yuan was setting the stage, his son, Li Shimin, was waiting in the wings, ready to take the Tang dynasty from its shaky startup phase to a full-blown empire IPO. Li Shimin, better known to the history books as Emperor Taizong, was the kind of guy who could turn a lukewarm takeover into a golden age. Picture him as the Steve Jobs of ancient China, minus the turtleneck, but with just as much visionary zeal and occasional ruthlessness. It's 626, and Taizong takes the reins in a manner so dramatic it would make a Shakespearean play look like a soap opera. After a tense family feud that culminated in the infamous Xuanwu Gate incident, where he eliminated his brothers in a move that was more Game of Thrones than the Brady Bunch, Taizong ascended the throne. While not exactly a poster boy for family values, he was certainly a poster boy for effective leadership, or at least a certain brand of it. Taizong was a man on a mission to transform the Tang dynasty from a promising newcomer into the heavyweight champion of Chinese history. His strategy: start by getting the bureaucratic house in order. Taizong introduced civil service examinations, a move that was as revolutionary as introducing Wi-Fi to a medieval castle. These exams were designed to ensure that government officials were chosen based on merit rather than the size of their family tree or the depth of their pockets. It was a system that brought a touch of democracy to the imperial autocracy, ensuring that the best and brightest minds were at the helm of the state machinery. But let's not get too misty-eyed over this meritocracy business. The exams weren't exactly open to everyone. Women, for instance, need not apply. And while the idea was to select officials based on talent, the reality was often more about rote memorization than critical thinking. Picture a giant imperial version of a spelling bee, but instead of spelling anti-disestablishmentarianism, you're reciting Confucian classics. Nonetheless, this system was a big step forward, and it laid the groundwork for a government that wasn't just an elite club of aristocrats swapping insider tips. Next on Taizong's to-do list was the equal field system, an agrarian reform so ambitious it makes modern land reforms look like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. The premise was simple: to divide land equitably among farmers to ensure that everyone had enough to eat and, crucially, enough to pay taxes. In practice, it was like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube blindfolded. The system aimed to prevent the rise of powerful landowners who could challenge the emperor's authority, a problem that had repeatedly plagued China like a bad recurring dream. The equal field system was a bit like communism before communism was cool or even a thing. Each family received a plot based on the number of people it had, ensuring that the land was used efficiently. The catch: the land wasn't truly theirs. It was more like a long-term rental, with the state as the ultimate landlord. This was less about altruism and more about ensuring the emperor had a steady stream of tax revenue to fund his various imperial pursuits, like defending the empire from those pesky northern invaders who seemed to think the Great Wall was more of a suggestion than a barrier. Under Taizong's rule, the Tang dynasty saw an economic boom that would make Wall Street investors green with envy. Trade routes, like the Silk Road, were the ancient version of the internet, connecting China with the rest of the world and bringing in not just goods, but ideas, cultures, and, occasionally, trouble. Chang'an, the capital, was a cosmopolitan hub, bustling with merchants, scholars, and travelers from as far afield as Persia and the Byzantine Empire. The city was so diverse, it made New York look like a monoculture. However, let's not pretend everything was sunshine and dumplings. The idealism of Taizong's reforms often met the harsh reality of human nature. Corruption was a constant companion, lurking in the shadows like an uninvited guest who just wouldn't leave. Despite the civil service exams, families with wealth and power still found ways to grease the wheels and ensure their offspring landed cushy government jobs. And while the equal field system was designed to prevent land concentration, in practice, it was like trying to contain water with a sieve. Landlords always found loopholes, and by the end of the dynasty, vast estates were once again in the hands of a few. Yet, the allure of this golden age wasn't just about reforms and policies. It was about the image Taizong projected, a wise and benevolent ruler steering the empire toward prosperity. His reign became the stuff of legend, romanticized in tales and histories as a time when wise governance and enlightened rule led to peace and prosperity. The reality was, of course, more complicated. Taizong's rule was as much about maintaining power through force when necessary as it was about wise administration. Taizong was a master of PR, crafting an image of himself as the philosopher king. He held court with scholars, commissioned histories, and wrote essays that showed off his intellect and vision. It was a bit like running a state-sponsored think tank where the main goal was to make the emperor look good. And it worked. Taizong's reign is remembered as one of the high points of Chinese civilization, a time when the empire was strong, the people were mostly content, and the future seemed as bright as a Tang porcelain vase. But let's not get too carried away with the legend. While Taizong's reign was undoubtedly a high point, it was also a time of underlying tensions and looming challenges. The very reforms that stabilized the dynasty also sowed the seeds of future conflicts. The civil service exams, while meritocratic in theory, created a new bureaucratic class that would eventually become as entrenched and corrupt as the aristocracy they replaced. The equal field system, despite its lofty goals, was unsustainable in the long run, leading to economic disparities that would haunt the dynasty's later years. So, there you have it. Emperor Taizong's reign was a time of great achievements and even greater contradictions. It was a golden age that glittered with the promise of reform and renewal, even as it was built on a foundation of ruthless ambition and pragmatic political maneuvering. The Tang dynasty, under Taizong, became a beacon of cultural and economic vitality, a testament to the power of vision tempered by reality. But like all golden ages, it was as fragile as it was brilliant, a reminder that history is as much about the stories we tell as the facts we live. As the glittering age of Emperor Taizong's reign unfolded, it was time for the Tang dynasty to hit its cultural stride. If you thought the Silk Road was just about trading silk, buckle up. This ancient trade route was the Amazon Prime of its day, shipping everything from spices to philosophies faster than you could say, 2-day delivery. It turned China into a buzzing hub of global interaction, with Chang'an at its heart, a city that was less a capital and more a bustling festival of cultures, ideas, and yes, the occasional scam artist. Chang'an was the toast of the ancient world, a city that could make modern metropolises look like sleepy hamlets. Picture a sprawling urban center with a population that could rival modern-day Los Angeles, over 1 million residents by the 8th century. It was a melting pot of cultures, languages, and thanks to the Silk Road, a parade of fashion choices that would make a runway model blush. Merchants and travelers from across Asia, the Middle East, and even the Byzantine Empire made their way to this cosmopolitan hub, turning it into a living museum of global diversity. But before you start imagining a utopia of harmony and cross-cultural potlucks, let's pump the brakes. While Chang'an was undeniably a center of cultural exchange, it was also a city of contradictions. Behind the facade of cosmopolitan grandeur lay the gritty realities of urban life. Think of it like New York City, exciting, diverse, and occasionally a little too much to handle. The streets were lined with traders hawking their wares, scholars debating philosophy, and artists vying for the patronage of the elite. Yet, amid the hustle and bustle, poverty and crime lurked in the shadows, ready to pounce on the unsuspecting. Now, let's talk about the cultural boom itself. The Tang dynasty wasn't just importing and exporting goods. It was exchanging ideas, art, and a fair share of cultural confusion. The poets of the Tang era were the rock stars of their day, and none more so than Li Bai and Du Fu. Li Bai, the original party poet, is known for his romantic verse and a fondness for the bottle that would make a frat boy proud. Meanwhile, Du Fu's poetry was more like a social commentary, full of reflections on the human condition that could make a philosopher nod in agreement. Yet, while their work captured the beauty and complexity of life, it also hinted at the underlying tensions that simmered beneath the surface of Tang society. The arts flourished under the Tang dynasty like never before. Calligraphy became an elevated form of expression, and painters captured the vibrancy of daily life with a keen eye for detail. But all that glitters isn't gold. The artistic patronage wasn't just about celebrating creativity. It was about propaganda and prestige. The wealthy and powerful commissioned pieces that glorified their own achievements and reinforced the image of a harmonious, prosperous society. Art was as much about politics as it was about beauty, a tool to shape perception and influence opinion. The Silk Road wasn't just a highway for goods and ideas. It was a superhighway for religions, too. Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and Nestorian Christianity all found fertile ground in China, each bringing its own flavor to the cultural potluck. But while the Tang dynasty is often praised for its religious tolerance, the reality was more a matter of pragmatic governance than pure idealism. Emperor Taizong and his successors understood that keeping the peace in such a diverse empire required a delicate balancing act, one that involved allowing religious freedom while maintaining a firm grip on power. However, the thriving trade and cultural exchange brought their own headaches. As with any major economic hub, Chang'an was a magnet for corruption and graft. The wealth that poured into the city was a tempting prize for officials with sticky fingers. Despite the civil service exams and various reforms, the bureaucracy was a leviathan that often moved at a glacial pace, and not without its fair share of greased palms. The romanticized vision of a meritocratic society was often undermined by the all-too-human penchant for bending the rules. As we dive deeper into the Tang dynasty's golden age, it's crucial to keep our rose-tinted glasses firmly in check. Yes, the era was marked by unprecedented cultural and economic achievements, but it was also a time of stark inequalities and social strife. The glittering facade was just that, a facade, often masking the less glamorous realities of life in a sprawling empire. For every Li Bai basking in poetic glory, there were countless others struggling to make ends meet in the bustling streets of Chang'an. The economic engine of the Tang dynasty, fueled by the Silk Road, was undeniably impressive. The trade networks brought not only wealth, but also a complex web of political alliances and rivalries. As goods flowed across borders, so too did the ambitions of rulers and the schemes of those seeking power. The Tang emperors, like savvy CEOs, had to navigate this intricate landscape with a mix of diplomacy and military might, ensuring that their empire remained a dominant force on the international stage. Yet, while the Silk Road was a symbol of connectivity, it was also a double-edged sword. The very networks that brought prosperity could also carry danger. Plagues and diseases traveled along the same routes as silks and spices, reminding the empire that globalization, even in ancient times, came with its own set of risks. The Tang dynasty's openness to the world was both its greatest strength and its Achilles' heel, a testament to the complex interplay of risk and reward that defines human endeavor. As we look back on the Tang dynasty's cultural zenith, it's tempting to get swept up in the romance of it all, the poetry, the art, the grand exchanges of ideas. But let's not forget the grittier side of the story. The Tang era was a time of remarkable achievements, yes, but also of immense challenges and contradictions. It was a time when the allure of the Golden Age masked the harsh realities of life in an empire forever teetering on the edge of chaos. So, as we prepare to explore the Tang dynasty's legacy further, let's keep our expectations balanced. This was an era of dazzling innovation and opportunity, but also one of profound complexity and human folly. The Tang dynasty was as much about the myths we've come to cherish as it was about the messy, unpredictable reality of life in one of history's most celebrated empires. Stay tuned for more tales from this fascinating period as we continue to unravel the threads of history and discover what lies beneath the surface of the Tang dynasty's golden age. And so, as we delve further into the Tang dynasty's golden age, the shimmer of prosperity begins to reveal its cracks. Behind the well-polished facade of cultural zenith and economic might, the empire was a bit like a house of cards, one gust away from a complete collapse. The events leading up to the Lushan rebellion of 755 serve as a reminder that even the most formidable empires can be undone by a combination of internal strife and external pressures. So let's set the stage for this epic implosion, which makes your average soap opera look like a lesson in stability. The Tang dynasty was cruising along, enjoying the fruits of its cultural and economic triumphs, when it hit a snag that would unravel faster than a cheap sweater. Enter the Lushan rebellion, named after its charismatic leader, Lushan, a general who was part warrior, part political schemer, and all trouble. Lushan, who was half Sogdian and half Turk, was the kind of guy who could charm the robes off an emperor. He rose through the military ranks with the ease of a cat burglar climbing a trellis, ultimately securing command over a vast swath of the empire's northeastern frontier. Now, you might wonder how someone like Lushan ended up leading a rebellion against the dynasty he served. Well, the answer lies in a cocktail of personal ambition and systemic vulnerabilities. Lushan wasn't just any general. He was the emperor's pet project, a trusted commander who had the ear of the court and the loyalty of his troops. But in a classic case of biting the hand that feeds you, Lushan had his sights set on the big prize, the imperial throne itself. In December 755, Lushan launched his rebellion, a move that was about as subtle as a cannonball through a stained glass window. What started as a military uprising quickly snowballed into a full-blown civil war, engulfing the empire in chaos and destruction. Lushan declared himself emperor of a new dynasty, the Yan, and marched his forces toward the Tang capital, Chang'an, like a juggernaut on a mission. The rebellion was less about ideological differences and more about power, plain and simple. It was a grab for the ultimate seat of authority, a calculated risk that played on the Tang dynasty's growing weaknesses. So, what made the Tang dynasty so vulnerable to this kind of upheaval? For starters, the empire's economic engine was sputtering. Despite the earlier boom, the equal field system was starting to show its age, like a once-trendy gadget that couldn't keep up with the latest apps. Land distribution had become increasingly skewed, with powerful families gobbling up estates like they were playing a game of Monopoly on steroids. This consolidation of land undermined the very foundations of the Tang economy, leaving the peasantry squeezed and resentful, a recipe for rebellion if ever there was one. The empire's fiscal woes were compounded by the cost of maintaining a vast military machine. Border defenses, campaigns against pesky neighbors, and internal security all demanded a chunk of the treasury that was beginning to look more like a piggy bank than a vault. The Tang government, desperate for revenue, resorted to raising taxes, a move about as popular as a power outage during the Super Bowl. Taxation was a burden that fell disproportionately on the lower classes, fueling discontent and sowing the seeds of dissent. Meanwhile, at the political level, the Tang court was a hotbed of intrigue and factionalism. The emperor, Xuanzong, who had once been a vibrant and capable ruler, was now more interested in the pleasures of court life than the affairs of state. His infatuation with his consort, Yang Gaifai, was the stuff of legend. a love story that sparked more drama than a reality TV show. While Xuanzong was busy playing the part of a besotted lover, the empire's administration was left to the whims of corrupt officials and power-hungry eunuchs, each with their own agenda. The combination of these factors, economic strain, political infighting, and military overreach, created a perfect storm for Enlil to exploit. His rebellion exposed the fragility of the Tang dynasty, turning what was once seen as an invincible empire into a house of cards trembling in the breeze. The initial successes of Enlil's forces were a wake-up call that the Tang's golden age had rusted at the edges, revealing an empire stretched too thin and vulnerable to the ambitions of a bold opportunist. As the rebellion raged on, the Tang dynasty's response was less than heroic. Emperor Xuanzong, faced with the enormity of the crisis, fled Chang'an, leaving the city and his loyal subjects to fend for themselves. The capital, once a bastion of order and magnificence, descended into chaos as Enlil's forces occupied the city in 756. Xuanzong's flight marked a nadir for the Tang, a moment when the unthinkable became reality and the dream of imperial invincibility crumbled into dust. The rebellion dragged on for nearly 8 years, a protracted conflict that bled the empire dry. The Tang forces, struggling to regain control, faced not only the military might of Enlil's troops, but also the internal divisions that had sapped their strength. The once mighty Tang army, now a shadow of its former self, battled to reclaim its lost prestige and territory, a task that proved as daunting as it was demoralizing. Eventually, the rebellion was quelled, but not without a heavy cost. Enlil himself was assassinated by his own son in 757, a dramatic twist worthy of a Shakespearean tragedy. Yet the damage was done. The Tang dynasty emerged from the conflict bruised and battered, its resources depleted, and its authority diminished. The rebellion had shattered the illusion of Tang supremacy, leaving behind an empire that was a patchwork of regional powers and competing interests. In the aftermath of the rebellion, the Tang dynasty struggled to regain its footing. The economic damage was severe, with agricultural production disrupted and trade routes in disarray. The once thriving Silk Road, the artery of cultural and economic exchange, was choked by instability and insecurity. The empire's coffers, once brimming with wealth, were now as empty as a beggar's bowl, forcing the government to rely on ad hoc measures to keep the machinery of state running. Politically, the dynasty faced a crisis of legitimacy. The central authority that had once commanded respect was eroded by the very forces it sought to control. Regional governors, emboldened by the chaos of the rebellion, began to assert their autonomy, carving out personal fiefdoms that operated with increasing independence from the imperial court. The Tang emperors, now little more than figureheads, found themselves at the mercy of these military strongmen, their power a shadow of what it had been. The Enlil rebellion serves as a stark reminder that even the most potent empires can fall victim to their own success. The very systems that had propelled the Tang dynasty to greatness were also its undoing, revealing the delicate balance between strength and vulnerability. It was a lesson in the perils of complacency and the dangers of overreach, a cautionary tale for all who seek to wield power without regard for the consequences. As the dust settled on the rebellion, the Tang dynasty was left to pick up the pieces. The path to recovery was long and arduous, marked by internal strife and external threats. Yet, even in its decline, the Tang remained a force to be reckoned with, a testament to the resilience of an empire that had weathered the storm of history. As we look ahead to the next chapter in this saga, it's clear that the story of the Tang dynasty is far from over. Stay tuned as we continue to explore the twists and turns of this remarkable period, uncovering the lessons it holds for those who dare to dream of greatness amidst the chaos of the world. Yet, even as the Tang dynasty limped away from the Enlil rebellion, its story was far from over. Imagine an empire with more lives than a cat, each resurrection more tenuous than the last. Despite the rebellion's devastation, the Tang dynasty soldiered on, albeit with a limp and a noticeable stutter. It was like watching an epic saga where the hero keeps getting up, even when the world seems determined to knock them down. In the aftermath, the Tang's power was more fragmented than a jigsaw puzzle tossed across a room. Regional warlords, once mere actors in the imperial drama, now fancied themselves directors of the show. They carved out their own little kingdoms, effectively reducing the emperor to a ceremonial figurehead whose decrees held about as much sway as a wish upon a star. The central government, once the iron grip of control, was now a loose handshake. The economic landscape was no less grim. The equal field system, once the backbone of the Tang's agrarian economy, had collapsed like a soufflé in a thunderstorm. Land ownership became a free-for-all, with wealthy families gobbling up territory faster than a kid with a bowl of Halloween candy. The Tang government, desperate for funds, resorted to selling official titles like they were concert tickets, turning the bureaucracy into a bloated, inefficient beast that would have been more at home in a Kafka novel than an imperial court. And then there was the small matter of border security, or the lack thereof. The once mighty Tang army, depleted and demoralized, was about as effective as a papier-mâché fortress. Invaders from all sides sniffed out the weakness like sharks, scenting blood in the water. The Tibetan Empire, the Uyghurs, and eventually even the kittens saw the Tang's vulnerability as an opportunity to nibble away at its edges. Each incursion a reminder that the empire's glory days were as distant as a fading echo. But let's not kid ourselves. The Tang's decline wasn't just a slow bleed of military might and economic stability. It was also a crisis of identity. The empire that had once been a beacon of cosmopolitan culture and intellectual vigor was now a shadow of its former self. The vibrant cultural exchanges that had defined the Tang's golden age fizzled into a kind of cultural inertia, where innovation was as rare as a unicorn in a parking lot. Chang'an, once a teeming metropolis of ideas and commerce, became a ghost of its former self, its streets echoing with the footsteps of a diminished populace. And yet, the story of the Tang isn't just one of decline and fall. It's a tale of remarkable resilience and, dare I say, stubbornness. Despite the mounting challenges, the Tang dynasty managed to hang on until 907, when the last emperor, Ari, was finally pushed out of power. But unlike the fiery endings of some empires, the Tang dynasty went out with a bureaucratic whimper rather than a warrior's roar. It was a case of death by 1,000 administrative cuts, a slow unraveling that left behind a legacy more complex than a Byzantine tapestry. So, what of this legacy? For starters, the Tang dynasty's influence on later Chinese history is as undeniable as it is complicated. It set the stage for the Song dynasty, which would pick up the pieces and usher in its own era of cultural and technological advancements. The civil service examination system, despite its flaws, established a model of meritocratic governance that would endure for centuries, shaping the bureaucratic backbone of China well into the modern era. Culturally, the Tang left a lasting imprint that continues to resonate. Its poetry, art, and philosophy became the touchstones of Chinese cultural identity, the benchmarks against which later generations would measure their own achievements. The Tang era's cosmopolitanism, though diminished, laid the groundwork for a cultural synthesis that would define Chinese civilization. The Silk Road, despite its disruptions, remained a symbol of the interconnectedness of the ancient world, a precursor to the global networks we see today. But let's not sugarcoat it. The Tang dynasty was as much about myth-making as it was about historical reality. The romanticized narratives of wise emperors and harmonious governance often gloss over the messy, human elements that defined the era. The Tang story is one of ambition, intrigue, and the relentless pursuit of power, a medieval soap opera with all the drama and none of the commercial breaks. In the end, the Tang dynasty's rise and fall is a reminder of the cyclical nature of power. Like a grand narrative pennied by a fickle author, empires rise to greatness only to fall prey to the very forces that propelled them to the top. The Tang dynasty, in all its glory and folly, serves as a poignant lesson in the complexities of history, a tale of triumph and tragedy, of legends and realities. As we close the chapter on the Tang dynasty, it's worth reflecting on the enduring lessons it offers. Its story is a testament to the resilience of human endeavor, the relentless drive for greatness tempered by the inevitable pull of decline. It reminds us that history is not just a series of dates and events, but a tapestry woven with the threads of human ambition, folly, and aspiration. So, as we bid farewell to the Tang, let's carry forward its legacy, both the myths we cherish and the realities we learn from, as we continue to navigate the ever-turning wheel of history. Hatshepsut's early life reads like the script of a royal reality show, complete with drama, power plays, and more eyeliner than a 1980s glam band. Born around 1507 BCE, she was the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I and his wife Ahmose. Now, Egyptian naming conventions are about as straightforward as a snake's path through the desert, so bear with me. Thutmose I wasn't just any pharaoh. He was a big deal, expanding Egypt's borders like a zealous land developer with a penchant for pyramids. Little did he know, his daughter would one day eclipse his achievements, without having to lift a single sword. The political landscape of Egypt at the time was as stable as a pyramid balanced on a camel's back. Power was everything, and it was heavily gendered. Boys got the throne, girls got a front-row seat to the action, often from the sidelines. But Hatshepsut was a different breed of royal. She had ambition seeping out of her every pore, and she wasn't about to let a little thing like gender norms get in her way. Now, Hatshepsut's family situation was something out of an ancient Egyptian soap opera. Her father, Thutmose I, had a multitude of children with various wives because, why settle for one family drama when you can have several? But fate had a way of throwing her a bone. When her father passed away, the throne went to her half-brother, Thutmose II, who was also her husband. Yes, you heard that right. They tied the knot in a classic move designed to keep the royal bloodline as pure as a Caesar salad without the croutons. Thutmose II's reign was short and not exactly illustrious. Imagine a pharaoh whose main claim to fame was that he was there. His reign lasted only about 13 years, filled with more behind-the-scenes intrigue than actual governance. Hatshepsut, on the other hand, was busy proving that she could play the political game with the best of them. She was not content to be a mere royal accessory. She had her eyes set on something much grander. Court life in Thebes was a spectacle of opulence and absurdity, with rituals that made modern-day reality TV look like a documentary. Hatshepsut navigated this testosterone-laden environment with the finesse of a cat burglar in a jewelry store, all while wearing a headdress that probably weighed more than her. The absurdity of court life was highlighted by the fact that while men strutted around with false beards and the air of entitlement, Hatshepsut was quietly laying the groundwork for her own ascendancy. She knew that to rule, she had to play the game better than anyone else. In this world of divine rulers who claimed to be the literal sons of gods, Hatshepsut concocted a backstory that would make any myth-maker proud. She claimed divine birth, insisting that the god Ammon had visited her mother in the form of Thutmose. It was a story that made Zeus's antics with swans and golden showers look like amateur hour. The message was clear. Hatshepsut was no ordinary woman. She was a divine ruler in her own right. Her marriage to Thutmose II was, by all accounts, a strategic alliance. While he sat on the throne, Hatshepsut was the real power behind it, a fact she made abundantly clear to anyone who dared to underestimate her. Her ambitious nature was evident in every decision she made, each one calculated to increase her influence and secure her position. As if being a woman in power wasn't hard enough, Hatshepsut had to contend with the absurdities of a male-dominated court where women were expected to be seen and not heard. But she had a knack for turning absurdity into opportunity. By the time Thutmose II died, she had positioned herself not just as a regent for the young Thutmose III, his son by another wife, but as a pharaoh in her own right. Hatshepsut's rise to power was anything but conventional. She declared herself king, not queen, because in Egypt, kingship was the ultimate form of rule, and she was nothing if not ultimate. She donned the traditional male regalia of a pharaoh, complete with the false beard, which must have been quite the sight given the rumors of her beauty. It was a bold move that not only challenged the status quo, but also rewrote the rules of the game. The absurdity of court life, with its complex rituals and power struggles, was no match for Hatshepsut's ambition and cunning. She knew that in order to maintain her grip on power, she had to project an image of stability and continuity. She embarked on building projects that would make her legacy as solid as the granite blocks of her monuments. Her ambition was as vast as the endless sands of Egypt, and she wasn't about to let a little thing like tradition stand in her way. In this male-dominated environment, Hatshepsut was a master of the political chessboard. She maneuvered through the corridors of power with the precision of a scribe's chisel, leaving her mark on history in a way that few women had before. Her story was not just one of ambition, but of resilience and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. So, as we set the stage for her eventual rise to power, remember this. Hatshepsut was a woman who refused to let the absurdities of her time define her. She carved out her own path, one monument at a time, proving that in the Game of Thrones, it's not just about playing the hand you're dealt. It's about reshuffling the deck entirely. As Hatshepsut prepared to reshuffle Egypt's political deck, she faced the small hurdle of a certain Thutmose III, who was probably still learning to write his own name in hieroglyphs when his dad, Thutmose II, took a one-way trip to the afterlife. With Thutmose III barely out of his diapers, or whatever the ancient Egyptian equivalent was, Hatshepsut saw a golden opportunity wrapped in linen. Thutmose II's death in 1479 BCE left a power vacuum that would have made a black hole jealous. Now, in the grand tradition of ancient Egyptian politics, there was no such thing as a peaceful transition of power. It was more like an epic game of musical chairs, and Hatshepsut was determined not to be left standing when the music stopped. She stepped in as regent, a role designed to keep the seat warm until little Thutmose III was old enough to rule. But Hatshepsut had no intention of being the royal babysitter. She had a throne to claim. Imagine the audacity. A woman declaring herself pharaoh in a world where the title was more testosterone-laden than a pro-wrestling match. But Hatshepsut knew that in order to pull off this ancient gender-bending power move, she needed more than just guts. She needed a killer PR campaign. Enter propaganda, ancient Egypt style. Forget about social media. Her tools were grander, more permanent, and carved in stone. Hatshepsut's most ingenious move was to co-opt the divine right to rule, a concept that was more sacred than a cat in a temple. She spun a tale of divine birth so intricately woven that it could have made even the most creative fiction writers of her time envious. According to her narrative, not only was she born of royal blood, but the god Ammon himself had descended in the form of Thutmose I to ensure her conception. It was a divine endorsement that would make modern political lobbyists weep with envy. This wasn't just a story for the masses. It was carved into the walls of her temple at Deir el-Bahri, a piece of ancient marketing that was less about subtle persuasion and more about divine decree. Her temple, still standing today, is a marvel of ancient architecture, with its terraced design and colonnades that could rival any modern architectural wonder. And let's not forget her statues. She had herself depicted wearing the traditional pharaoh's kilt and false beard, because why let gender norms get in the way of a good makeover? But deifying oneself wasn't just about vanity, it was about survival. In a time when political legitimacy was as shaky as a three-legged stool, Hatshepsut needed to solidify her claim to the throne with divine backing. The priests of Ammon, who were essentially the ancient world's power brokers, played a crucial role in her narrative. By aligning with them, she ensured that her story was not just a passing myth, but a state-sanctioned truth. It was the ancient equivalent of getting a blue checkmark on Twitter, but with a lot more stone carving involved. Hatshepsut didn't stop at divine genealogy. She also engaged in some strategic cultural rebranding. She was a pharaoh who ruled by innovation, not intimidation. Her reign saw a boom in trade, most famously with the mysterious land of Punt, which was like the El Dorado of its time, rich, exotic, and slightly mythical. The trade expeditions brought back gold, ivory, and incense, which were more than just luxury items. They were symbols of her prosperity and power. And let's not forget the obelisks, those towering monuments that were the ancient world's version of skyscrapers. Erected at Karnak Temple, these stone needles weren't just architectural wonders. They were statements. They screamed, "Look at me, I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Each obelisk was a testament to her reign, literally etched in stone, ensuring her legacy would outlast any papyrus scroll. Hatshepsut's reign was a masterclass in ancient PR, a blend of divine myth-making and tangible achievements that left an indelible mark on Egypt's landscape and history. She navigated the complex web of male-dominated politics with a finesse that was both strategic and bold, proving that in the Game of Thrones, it's not just about who you are, but also about who you claim to be. In the end, Hatshepsut's ascent to power was a brilliant chess move in a game that was rigged against her from the start. She transformed the very nature of Egyptian kingship, challenging centuries of tradition with a deftness that would make any modern CEO nod in admiration. So, as we continue to explore her reign, keep in mind that Hatshepsut wasn't just rewriting the rules. She was creating a whole new game. Now, as we delve into Hatshepsut's reign, imagine her not just as a shrewd political player, but as an ancient CEO with a vision board that included a thriving economy, jaw-dropping architecture, and a trading empire that would put modern multinationals to shame. She wasn't just sitting on a throne, twiddling her royal thumbs. She was out there redefining what it meant to rule Egypt. Her architectural projects were so grand, they made the pyramids look like starter homes. Let's start with the piece de resistance of her architectural endeavors, the temple at Deir el-Bahri. This wasn't just any temple. It was a 3-story, terraced marvel carved right into the cliffs of Thebes. It's like the ancient Egyptian version of a penthouse suite, complete with breathtaking views of the Nile. Built around 1470 BCE, this masterpiece was constructed over a decade, employing thousands of workers who, presumably, had some serious biceps by the time it was done. And why stop at a simple temple when you can have a complex with sanctuaries, chapels, and a courtyard that could host the fanciest of royal functions? This temple wasn't just about flexing architectural muscles, though it certainly did that. It was a strategic PR move designed to cement Hatshepsut's divine status. The walls were adorned with reliefs depicting her birth from the god Ammon, basically ancient Egypt's version of a Who's Your Daddy episode minus the drama. There were also scenes of her trading expeditions to Punt, a land so exotic and wealthy it might as well have been called Charching. Here, Hatshepsut is shown receiving myrrh, incense, and other goodies, basically the bling of the ancient world. Now, let's talk about Punt, because what's a good ruler without a touch of international flair? Punt was like the Dubai of the ancient world, rich, mysterious, and ridiculously hard to find on a map. Hatshepsut's expedition, there was a masterstroke of diplomacy and trade. She sent a fleet of ships down the Red Sea, loaded with goods to barter, like a well-heeled tourist heading to an exclusive marketplace. The expedition returned laden with gold, ebony, ivory, and exotic animals, which were essentially the ancient world's equivalent of a luxury haul. This wasn't just about acquiring shiny things. It was about positioning Egypt as a powerhouse of trade and culture. These international exchanges were more than just economic boons. They were a way to show that Hatshepsut was playing on a global stage. She was essentially saying, "Look at me, I can juggle international diplomacy, divine status, and architectural wonders all at once." Beat that. Her reign saw a flourishing of arts and culture, as the wealth flowing in from these expeditions funded everything from temple building to the commissioning of magnificent statues. It was like the Egyptian Renaissance, with Hatshepsut as its Medici. But let's not forget the obelisks, those sky-high needles that were both architectural wonders and cosmic antennae. Hatshepsut had 2 massive obelisks erected at Karnak Temple, each weighing over 320 tons and standing nearly 100 feet tall. They were carved from a single piece of granite, a feat that still baffles modern engineers. These obelisks weren't just impressive for their size. They were inscribed with Hatshepsut's achievements, ensuring that her legacy was literally written in stone. They served as eternal reminders of her reign, their tips gilded to catch the sun's rays and shine like beacons across the land. Of course, with great monuments come great expenses. Hatshepsut's building spree didn't come cheap, but it was an investment in her legacy and the Egyptian economy. The constructions provided jobs for artisans, builders and labourers, stimulating economic growth. Meanwhile, the trade expeditions brought in resources that funded further projects, creating a cycle of prosperity. It was a win-win, as long as you weren't one of the poor souls lugging granite blocks up a ramp in the scorching sun. Yet, as with any grand narrative, there's always a bit of myth to debunk. Some might imagine Hatshepsut's reign as a time of uninterrupted peace and prosperity, but the reality was more nuanced. While she was busy commissioning temples and obelisks, she had to constantly navigate the choppy waters of Egyptian politics. Her stepson, Thutmose III, wasn't exactly thrilled about her extended rule and was reportedly biding his time, sharpening his proverbial knives. Hatshepsut's reign was a delicate balancing act, a testament not just to her ambition, but to her ability to maintain power in a world ready to dethrone her at the first sign of weakness. And so, as we continue to explore Hatshepsut's reign, remember that her story is as much about the monuments she left behind as it is about the political maneuvers that allowed her to build them. She wasn't just a ruler. She was a trailblazer, a visionary who transformed Egypt's landscape and economy, all while rewriting the rules of power. As we look to the next chapter of her life, let's keep our eyes on those obelisks, standing tall as markers of her indomitable spirit and strategic genius. As we leave those towering obelisks glistening in the Egyptian sun, let's shift our gaze to the shadowy corners of Hatshepsut's court, where intrigue lurked like a Nile crocodile ready to snap. You see, even in an era where you could claim divine parentage and carve it into stone, human politics were as messy as a chariot race on a rainy day. Hatshepsut's reign wasn't just a series of grand architectural feats. It was a high-wire act of political maneuvering, with opposition as constant as the desert wind. First, let's talk about the traditionalists, those die-hard fans of the status quo who likely saw Hatshepsut's rule as a cosmic joke. To them, a woman on the throne was as absurd as a cat ruling a pack of jackals. Egypt had always been a patriarchal society, after all, where the pharaoh was supposed to be the living incarnation of male divinity. Hatshepsut had already shattered this glass ceiling with her scepter, but that didn't mean everyone was cheering from the sidelines. These traditionalists were like the ancient world's equivalent of internet trolls, whispering opposition and scheming under the radar. Then there was Thutmose III, Hatshepsut's stepson, who by all accounts was like a young lion waiting in the wings. He was technically co-ruler, but that was just a decorative title like a plastic tiara at a child's birthday party. While Hatshepsut was busy running the kingdom and redefining what it meant to be a pharaoh, Thutmose III was growing up in the shadows, sharpening his military acumen and presumably his patience. Talk about a looming presence. It was like having a ticking clock in the corner of your office, only this clock had ambitions and a legitimate claim to the throne. Now, let's add a sprinkle of conspiracy into this royal cocktail. Hatshepsut's later years were rife with rumors of plots against her life. While concrete evidence is as elusive as a mirage, it's not hard to imagine a few would-be usurpers plotting in the shadows. After all, when you're the most powerful woman in a male-dominated world, you can bet there were a few disgruntled nobles and priests who wouldn't mind seeing you take an unexpected trip to the afterlife. It's the kind of drama that makes modern political scandals look like playground squabbles. Yet Hatshepsut wasn't just a ruler. She was a chess master, adept at countering moves before they were even made. Her strategic marriages within the royal family were like pieces on a board, placed to secure alliances and neutralize opposition. It's as if she had a sixth sense for political survival, ensuring that her inner circle was as tight as the wrappings on a mummy. By marrying off her daughter Neferia to influential figures like Senenmut, a commoner who rose to become one of her most trusted advisors, she solidified her power base. Senenmut, by the way, was quite the character himself, a man of humble beginnings who climbed the ranks faster than a pyramid builder on payday. Let's take a moment to appreciate the economic savvy behind these moves. Marriages were more than unions of hearts. They were mergers and acquisitions of the ancient world. By aligning herself with powerful figures and their resources, Hatshepsut ensured that her reign was not just a political statement, but an economic powerhouse. Wealth was the oil that kept the wheels of her administration turning, and she knew how to keep those wheels greased. Meanwhile, Thutmose III was probably off training with the army, building his muscles and his reputation. He was a military prodigy, and Hatshepsut knew better than to underestimate him. If the rumors of her attempts on her life were true, then Thutmose would have been an obvious suspect. But he was biding his time, a testament to his own strategic patience. After all, in the game of ancient politics, the best move was often the one not made, at least not until the perfect moment. Hatshepsut also had to contend with the powerful clergies, particularly the priests of Ammon. These priests were the kingmakers of their day, wielding influence that could make or break a pharaoh. By claiming Ammon as her divine father, she had initially secured their support, but maintaining it required constant attention. It was a delicate dance of offerings, temple constructions, and political favors. She played the role of both benefactor and ruler, ensuring that the temples remained loyal and her divine narrative stayed intact. And let's not forget the economic context of all this. Hatshepsut had transformed Egypt into a trading juggernaut, with wealth flowing in from all corners of the known world. Her expeditions to Punt were not just about acquiring luxury items. They were about demonstrating Egypt's reach and influence. It was a message carved into every ounce of gold and ivory. Egypt was a force to be reckoned with, and its pharaoh was not to be trifled with. Yet, despite her successes, or perhaps because of them, the whispers of dissent never fully faded. The traditionalists, the ambitious Thutmose III, and the ever-watchful priests of Ammon were constant reminders of the precariousness of her position. Hatshepsut's reign was a testament to her ability to navigate these treacherous waters, maintaining her grip on power with an astuteness that would make Machiavelli nod in approval. As we leave this chapter of her life, poised on the brink of what would become a legendary yet turbulent legacy, remember this. Hatshepsut was not just a ruler who defied the norms. She was a strategist of the highest order, playing a game that few could even conceive. Her story is one of resilience in the face of opposition, a saga of power plays and political intrigue that continues to fascinate scholars and storytellers alike. As we turn the page, ready to dive deeper into the twilight of her reign, know that the best, and perhaps the most dramatic, is yet to come. And so, as Hatshepsut's reign reached its zenith, the stage was set for an exit worthy of a Shakespearean twist. She left behind a legacy of monumental architecture and thriving trade, but as with any gripping story, the end came with a mystery and a dash of intrigue. Around 1458 BCE, Hatshepsut disappeared from the historical record. One day she was there, ruling with the confidence of a seasoned CEO, and the next she was gone, leaving behind more questions than answers. Now, when it comes to Hatshepsut's vanishing act, historians have more theories than a conspiracy theorist at a UFO convention. Did she die of natural causes? Did she fall victim to foul play? Or did she simply retire, deciding that after 2 decades of ruling an ancient superpower, she'd earned a break? The truth is as elusive as the sands of the Sahara. Her mummy, believed to have been identified in 2007 in the Valley of the Kings, suggests she lived into her 50s, an impressive feat in an era where life expectancy was about as long as a modern Hollywood marriage. Regardless of the cause, her disappearance opened the door for Thutmose III. The young lion, who had spent years in the political wilderness, was finally ready to claim his rightful place on the throne. If you think he was content with just ruling, think again. Thutmose III embarked on a campaign that was part military conquest, part historical revisionism. He expanded Egypt's borders with a zeal that would make any empire builder proud. Yet, his most significant conquest might have been against his predecessor's memory. In a move that would make any modern PR spin doctor nod in grim appreciation, Thutmose III set about erasing Hatshepsut's legacy. Her statues were toppled, her name was chiseled out of monuments, and her achievements were attributed to other rulers. It was like an ancient version of hitting the delete key, but with significantly more stone carving involved. This wasn't just about personal vendetta. It was a calculated political strategy. Thutmose III needed to solidify his rule and ensure that future generations saw him as the legitimate continuation of Thutmose's lineage, not as a footnote in Hatshepsut's story. This historical erasure was thorough, but not entirely successful. Like trying to delete your browser history, traces of Hatshepsut's reign stubbornly persisted. Her magnificent temple at Deir el-Bahari stood as a testament to her reign, its walls whispering stories of her achievements to anyone who cared to listen. And listen they did, eventually. It took modern archaeologists centuries to piece together the puzzle of her life, a task that was part detective work, part historical forensics. Her rediscovery reads like an Indiana Jones adventure, minus the rolling boulders. In the 19th century, scholars began to connect the dots, realizing that this remarkable ruler had been hiding in plain sight all along. Her obelisks, her temple, her trading expeditions, these were not the works of a mere regent or a sidelined queen. They were the legacy of a pharaoh who had rewritten the rules of power. As historians unearthed her story, they also uncovered the myths and realities that had swirled around her reign. The romanticized version paints her as a benevolent ruler, a proto-feminist icon who defied the patriarchy. The reality, of course, is messier. Hatshepsut was as shrewd and ambitious as any ruler of her time, using divine claims and political alliances to maintain her grip on the throne. She was a pioneer, yes, but she was also a product of her era, navigating a world where power was a precarious balancing act. The irony is rich. A ruler who was nearly erased from history has become one of its most fascinating figures. Her story is a testament to the resilience of legacy, proving that you can't simply chisel away the past. Hatshepsut's achievements have endured, not as ghostly whispers, but as bold declarations of what she accomplished in a world that tried to forget her. In the grand tapestry of history, Hatshepsut's tale is a reminder that legacy is often more about who tells the story than who lived it. She may have been nearly lost to the sands of time, but her rediscovery is a testament to the enduring power of historical truth over myth. So next time you find yourself wandering through a museum or gazing up at an ancient monument, remember Hatshepsut. Her story is etched in stone, a defiant reminder that even history's most determined efforts to erase a legacy can never truly succeed. She may have been a footnote in the annals of Thutmose III's reign, but in the end, it's her story that captivates us, a tale of ambition, resilience, and the indomitable spirit of a woman who ruled an empire. In the grand theatre of ancient empires, the Sasanian Empire burst onto the stage like a surprise headliner at a concert no one saw coming. Born from the smouldering ruins of the Parthian Empire in 224 CE, this was a realm that didn't so much rise from the ashes as it did kick down the door and announce, "We're here, deal with it." And at the helm of this dramatic entrance was Ardashir, a guy with the ambition of a startup founder and the charisma of a rock star. Ardashir wasn't your typical ancient ruler plucked from noble lineage and handed a crown on a velvet pillow. Nope, this guy started from the historical equivalent of the mailroom. He was the son of Papak, a local ruler in the region of Persis, modern-day Fars in Iran. Now, Persis was a place known for its rugged landscapes and equally rugged people. Think of it as the Texas of ancient Iran, minus the cowboy hats, but with plenty of firepower. With the Parthian Empire crumbling like a soggy biscuit, Ardashir saw an opportunity. And like any good opportunist, he seized it with both hands. In 224 CE, he dealt the final blow to the Parthian king Artabanus V at the Battle of Hormozgan. This wasn't just a skirmish. It was a seismic shift in power dynamics. Ardashir wasn't just claiming a throne, he was laying the foundation for a whole new empire. But how do you go from being a regional player to the big leagues? Well, Ardashir's strategy was as ancient as it was effective. Unite or be united. He spent the next few years knocking on the doors of neighboring territories, offering them a choice. Join voluntarily or get convinced by the business end of a sword. By the time he was done, Ardashir had transformed a patchwork of feuding territories into a formidable empire that even Rome had to acknowledge, albeit begrudgingly. Now let's talk cash flow, because every empire, no matter how grand, needs a solid economic backbone. Enter the Sasanian silver coins, the ancient world's version of a brand new credit card. These coins didn't just jingle in the pockets of traders, they were a statement. They featured images of Ardashir himself, showcasing his power and divine right to rule. The economy didn't just run on these coins, it strutted. The Sasanians also had a knack for expansion that made their neighbors sweat. Unlike other empires that expanded for the sake of expansion, the Sasanians had a method to their madness. Their expansion strategies were less about conquering lands for sheer bragging rights, and more about securing trade routes and resources. After all, controlling the Silk Road was like owning a toll booth on the highway to the east. It was pure economic genius. So, how did this scrappy newcomer become a thorn in the side of Rome? Well, it wasn't just about land grabs and shiny coins. The Sasanian military was no slouch. They refined the use of heavy cavalry or cataphracts, which were basically tanks on legs. These armored warriors were the ancient equivalent of a sports car, fast, flashy, and incredibly effective. With their help, the Sasanians could punch well above their weight, leading to a series of skirmishes and wars with Rome that historians would later call the Roman-Sasanian Wars. A title that, while not the most imaginative, gets the point across. In this Game of Thrones, Ardashir wasn't just about military might and economic savvy. He also played the long game by promoting a sense of Persian cultural identity. He revitalized the religion of Zoroastrianism, which not only unified his people under a common faith, but also fortified his rule with a divine endorsement. This wasn't just about spirituality. It was a clever political move that helped solidify Ardashir's power, and by extension, the very fabric of the Sasanian Empire. Ardashir's vision laid the groundwork for an empire that would last over 4 centuries, a testament to his leadership and the resilience of the Sasanian people. He passed the torch to his son, Shapur, who would continue to vex Rome and expand the empire's influence. But that's a story for another time. For now, let's linger on the legacy of a man who pulled an empire from the brink of obscurity and thrust it into the annals of history. The Sasanians weren't just another footnote in the chronicles of time. They were a force to be reckoned with, a statement of resistance and resilience that echoed through the ages. And it all started with Ardashir, a man who turned ambition into empire building and left an indelible mark on the world stage. As Ardashir's legacy simmered in the ancient cauldron of empires, his son Shapur took the stage with the flair of a showman who knew he had a tough act to follow, but wasn't about to let that stop him. Shapur wasn't content with just holding onto what dear old dad had cobbled together. Oh no, he was all about upping the ante. If Ardashir built the stage, Shapur was here to light it on fire, figuratively, of course, but the impact was no less explosive. Shapur was a man with a plan, and that plan involved Rome. Now, if you think of Rome as the heavyweight champion of the ancient world, then Shapur was the scrappy underdog who managed to land a few solid punches. This wasn't just about military muscle, though Shapur had plenty of that with his reorganized and formidable army. We're talking about a guy who captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in 260 CE, not exactly a small feat. Imagine the jaw-dropping spectacle of a Roman emperor paraded around as a prisoner. It was the kind of PR victory that empires dream of. But let's not get too misty-eyed about Shapur's military prowess without acknowledging the gritty reality beneath the glitter. His campaigns, while impressive, were costly, both in terms of resources and human lives. It's easy to romanticize the might and grandeur of ancient warfare, but the truth is, behind every victory lay a trail of devastation. The financial drain could have sunk a lesser ruler, but Shapur had the foresight to bolster his coffers through shrewd trade and diplomacy. He turned the Silk Road into his personal cash cow, milking it for every exotic good that traversed its dusty paths. Think luxury textiles, spices and precious stones, ancient bling that kept the economy humming. Shapur wasn't just a hammer, he was a scalpel too. His diplomatic finesse smoothed the rough edges of his military conquests. He orchestrated alliances that expanded the empire's influence far beyond its borders, weaving a tapestry of relationships that stretched from the Roman Empire to the Gupta dynasty in India. Shapur's vision was global before global was even a thing, and his ability to play nice when necessary ensured the Sasanian Empire wasn't just feared but respected, or at least tolerated, by those who mattered. Now, let's pivot to the cultural renaissance that unfurled under Shapur's reign. This was no mere footnote in the empire's history, it was a defining chapter. He commissioned architectural marvels that still stagger the imagination. Take the grandiose city of Bishapur, for example, built with a Roman flair. Ironic, right? It was a testament to the empire's cosmopolitan nature. The city boasted intricate mosaics and carved reliefs that depicted Shapur's victories in all their glory, a visual flex that would make any influencer envious. But Shapur wasn't content with just leaving a mark on stone. He also reinforced the foundation of Zoroastrianism, the empire's spiritual backbone. This wasn't some half-hearted religious revival, it was a full-on renaissance. Temples sprang up like daisies in spring, and the priestly class gained significant power, acting as both spiritual leaders and political advisors. Zoroastrianism wasn't just about fire temples and sacred chants. It was a unifying force that bound the empire together. It provided a shared identity that was crucial for an empire as diverse as the Sasanian. Speaking of diversity, let's not gloss over the empire's cosmopolitan nature. The Sasanians were nothing if not a melting pot of cultures, languages, and ideas. This wasn't just a happy accident, it was a deliberate strategy. By welcoming scholars, artists, and traders from across the known world, the empire became a crucible of innovation. It was like the Silicon Valley of its time, minus the tech, but with plenty of intellectual horsepower. But before we crown Shapur as the ultimate Sasanian king, let's pause to acknowledge that his reign was not without its critics. Some might argue he was too focused on expansion, that he spread the empire too thin. And while his military and cultural achievements were impressive, they came at a cost. The burden of war and monumental building projects weighed heavily on the populace, sparking murmurs of discontent. Shapur's reign was a balancing act between ambition and pragmatism, and while he walked that tightrope with aplomb, it was a precarious path. After Shapur, the empire experienced a series of ups and downs, like a roller coaster without the safety harness. Fast forward a couple of centuries, and we arrive at the reign of Khosrow I, known to some as Anishiruwan, which roughly translates to immortal soul. Now, if that name doesn't scream legend in the making, I don't know what does. Khosrow I was a reformer with a capital R. He took a look at the empire's fiscal policies and said, "This simply won't do." Cue the introduction of a revamped tax system, which, while not the most glamorous of reforms, was a game-changer. It was a progressive taxation system that took into account the wealth of the taxpayer. Sound familiar? That's right, folks, Khosrow was ahead of his time, embracing economic policies that wouldn't look out of place in a modern fiscal textbook. But Khosrow wasn't just about number crunching. He was a patron of the arts and sciences, a veritable Medici of the ancient world. Under his reign, the famed Academy of Gundishapur flourished, becoming a beacon of learning and innovation. Think of it as the Harvard of its day, attracting scholars from all corners of the globe. Medicine, astronomy, philosophy, you name it, they studied it. This wasn't just academic navel-gazing. The knowledge cultivated here had real-world applications, influencing everything from architecture to agriculture. In the realm of diplomacy, Khosrow was no slouch either. He played a masterful game of geopolitical chess, navigating alliances and rivalries with a deft hand. His dealings with the Byzantine Empire, for example, were a mix of conflict and cooperation. They were frenemies before the term even existed, engaging in a series of wars while also exchanging ideas and goods. It was a complex relationship, but one that Khosrow managed with finesse. He understood that diplomacy was as much about what you didn't do as what you did, and his restraint often spoke volumes. Yet, even as Khosrow's reign brought stability and prosperity, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. The empire's vast expanse was both a blessing and a curse, requiring constant vigilance to maintain control. The challenge of governing such a diverse realm was akin to herding cats. Each province had its own needs and quirks, demanding a flexible yet firm approach. Khosrow's ability to balance these competing demands was a testament to his leadership, but it was a struggle that would persist long after his time. As the golden age of the Sasanian Empire unfolded, it was clear that the seeds planted by Ardashir and nurtured by Shapur and Khosrow had grown into a mighty oak. Yet, even as the empire basked in its zenith, the shadows of future challenges loomed on the horizon. The story of the Sasanian Empire was far from over, and the coming chapters promised both triumphs and tribulations. In this ongoing saga of power, culture, and intrigue, the Sasanians left their indelible mark on history. Their legacy is a tapestry woven with threads of ambition, innovation, and resilience, a testament to the enduring spirit of an empire that dared to dream big, and for a time succeeded beyond its wildest imaginings. As the Sasanian Empire basked in its glowing heyday, little did it know that beneath its polished exterior lay the seeds of its own undoing, much like a shiny apple with a wormy core. The empire had thrived on grand ambitions and audacious rulers, but the foundation was starting to show cracks. Picture this: an empire stretched over 15 million square kilometers, trying to juggle a diverse population with as much coordination as a one-man band. It was a logistical nightmare waiting to happen. First up on the list of woes was social unrest. The empire was like a pressure cooker with a faulty valve, and the heat was rising. The vast Sasanian territory was home to a mosaic of cultures, languages, and religions, each with its own set of beliefs and grievances. Managing this human tapestry was like herding cats. Each group had its own agenda, and not all were thrilled about being part of the Sasanian narrative. The empire's heavy-handed approach to governance didn't help. It was a classic case of trying to fit square pegs into round holes, and the pegs were starting to splinter. Religious tensions added fuel to the fire. The Sasanians had banked heavily on Zoroastrianism as the empire's unifying force, but not everyone was on board with this monotheistic program. Many regions had their own religious traditions, and the empire's push for Zoroastrian dominance was about as popular as a tax audit. The Christian population, for instance, found themselves in a particularly tight spot. The Sasanians, ever suspicious of Rome's influence, viewed the Christians with a wary eye, suspecting them of being Rome's fifth column. This led to a series of persecutions that probably made the Christians wish they had just stayed under Roman rule. The empire's religious policy was akin to trying to fit everyone into a single mold, and unsurprisingly, it led to fractures rather than unity. And then there's the economy, that fickle beast that can make or break empires. The Sasanian economy had once strutted like a peacock, thanks to its control over the Silk Road and a robust taxation system. But wars are expensive, and the empire's ongoing skirmishes with the Byzantine Empire were draining the treasury faster than a leaky bucket. It's estimated that during the Byzantine, Sasanian wars, which spanned from 602 to 628 CE, the cost to the Sasanian coffers was astronomical. We're talking about a financial hemorrhage that would make any accountant weep. The Sasanians were caught in a vicious cycle. They needed money to fund their wars, but the wars were depleting their resources. The Byzantine Empire was no pushover. Their confrontations with the Sasanians were intense, and each side fought with the determination of a dog with a bone. For example, The Byzantine-Sasanian War of 602–628 was a grueling conflict, often resembling a game of tug-of-war with no end in sight. The two empires clashed over key territories like Mesopotamia, Armenia, and the Levant, areas that were as strategically vital as they were contested. Each battle drained resources and morale, leaving both empires battered and bruised. The cost of war wasn't just financial, it was human. The continuous drain on manpower left the empire stretched thin, like butter scraped over too much bread. Soldiers who should have been defending the empire's borders were tied up in endless campaigns, leaving other areas vulnerable. It's no surprise that the Sasanian military, once a formidable force, began to show signs of wear and tear. The same cataphracts that had once been the envy of the ancient world couldn't be everywhere at once. Back home, the empire faced the Herculean task of managing a sprawling territory with limited resources. Imagine trying to govern an empire the size of modern-day Iran, Iraq, parts of the Arabian Peninsula, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, all without the benefits of modern bureaucracy or communication. It was like trying to run a marathon in flip-flops, possible but not advisable. The administrative framework also began to creak under the strain. The empire's bureaucrats were the unsung heroes, or villains, depending on your perspective, who kept the machine running. However, corruption was rife, and inefficiency was as common as sand in the desert. Tax collectors, often more feared than loved, squeezed the populace for every last coin, leading to widespread dissatisfaction. The famous Sasanian silver coins, once the pride of the empire, began to lose their luster as inflation reared its ugly head. Regional governors, or marsbans, were tasked with maintaining order, but their loyalties were often as fluid as quicksand. With the central government struggling to maintain control, some marsbans saw an opportunity to act like mini-kings in their own right. This decentralization was a double-edged sword. It provided local autonomy, but it also meant that the empire's cohesion was hanging by a thread. In this climate of discontent and division, whispers of rebellion began to surface. The seeds of revolution often take root in the soil of dissatisfaction, and the Sasanians were no exception. The empire's attempts to quell these murmurs were like playing whack-a-mole. Every time one was stamped out, another would pop up elsewhere. The situation was becoming increasingly untenable, and it seemed like only a matter of time before the cracks in the empire's facade became impossible to ignore. So, as the Sasanian Empire trudged through its golden years, the challenges it faced were a potent mix of internal and external pressures. The glories of Ardashir, Shapur, and Khosrow seemed like distant memories as the empire tried to navigate the murky waters of its own making. Yet, despite these challenges, the Sasanian story was far from over. The empire still had a few tricks up its sleeve, and the next chapters promised to be just as riveting as the last. Stay tuned for more drama, intrigue, and the kind of history that keeps historians up at night. As the Sasanian Empire teetered on the brink of its golden decline, it found itself at a crossroads, staring down the barrel of history's loaded gun. The empire's past glories were as faded as an old photograph, and the future was looking about as inviting as a dentist's chair. But just when things seemed like they couldn't get any worse, enter stage left, the Islamic Caliphate. Talk about timing. It was like the Sasanians were juggling flaming torches, and someone decided to toss them a chainsaw for good measure. The rise of the Islamic Caliphate was as unexpected as a plot twist in a telenovela. In the early 7th century, while the Sasanians were busy dealing with their Byzantine bromance gone wrong, the Arabian Peninsula was experiencing its own seismic shift. Mohammed and his followers were stirring the pot, spreading a new religious and political ideology faster than a viral meme. By the time Mohammed passed away in 632 CE, his successors, the caliphs, were ready to take the Arabian show on the road. And where did their expansionist gaze fall? You guessed it, right on the patchwork quilt of the Sasanian Empire. Now, the Sasanians might have been able to handle this new threat if they weren't already dealing with their own internal dumpster fire. The empire was still reeling from the Byzantine-Sasanian War, which had ended in 628 CE. That conflict was like a marathon boxing match, and while the Sasanians had landed some impressive punches, they'd also taken quite a beating. The treasury was emptier than a hipster cafe on a Monday morning, and the military was as worn out as a pair of old sneakers. It was a classic example of being caught with your pants down, metaphorically speaking, of course. And then came the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah. This wasn't just another clash of armies. It was the kind of showdown that makes history books sit up and take notice. Taking place in 636 CE near the banks of the Euphrates River, Al-Qadisiyah was the battle that would determine the fate of the Sasanian Empire. The Caliphate's forces, led by the savvy general Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, were up against the Sasanians, who were led by their own seasoned general, Rostam Farrakhzad. Rostam was as tough as old boots, but even he was feeling the heat of leading a battered army into another fight. Al-Qadisiyah was a slugfest that lasted 4 days, with each side throwing everything they had into the fray. The Sasanians, with their famed war elephants and heavily armored cataphracts, were a terrifying sight. But here's the thing. Elephants, while intimidating, were also as unpredictable as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. The Islamic forces, on the other hand, were nimble and had the added advantage of being highly motivated, driven by a sense of divine mission. The battle saw twists and turns that would make a roller coaster look tame. But in the end, it was the Sasanians who were left licking their wounds. Rostam was killed, and with his death, any semblance of coordinated resistance crumbled like a house of cards. Myths abound about the battle, and while it's tempting to romanticize Rostam's last stand as a heroic epic, the reality was less glamorous. The defeat at Al-Qadisiyah wasn't just a military loss. It was a psychological blow that rocked the empire to its core. The Sasanian front lines were as thin as a Hollywood plot, and the defeat opened the floodgates for further Islamic expansion. It was a domino effect, and the pieces were falling fast. The fall of Ctesiphon soon followed. Ctesiphon, the jewel in the Sasanian crown, and a city that had seen more than its fair share of imperial drama, was captured by the Islamic forces in 637 CE. The city, with its grand palaces and bustling bazaars, was stripped of its treasures, and its fall marked the beginning of the end for the Sasanian Empire. Imagine the scene. The once mighty capital, reduced to a shadow of its former self, its splendor now the spoils of a new power on the rise. It was the kind of historical moment that makes you want to grab a bucket of popcorn and watch the drama unfold, if it weren't so tragic for the Sasanians. Yet, even as the Sasanian Empire was being stripped down like a second-hand car for parts, not everyone was ready to throw in the towel. Yazdijerd III, the last Sasanian king, was doing his best impression of a king on the run. He was like the protagonist in an action movie, trying to rally what was left of his shattered army while staying one step ahead of the advancing Islamic forces. His efforts were valiant, but the odds were about as encouraging as a snowball's chance in a blast furnace. By 651 CE, Yazdijerd was dead, and with him, the Sasanian Empire officially faded into the annals of history. There's a tendency to paint the Sasanian downfall as inevitable, a foregone conclusion sealed by the rise of the Islamic Caliphate. But the truth, it's a bit messier. The empire was already teetering on the edge due to its own internal issues, a cocktail of political infighting, economic woes, and social unrest. The Islamic forces didn't so much topple an empire as give it a well-timed shove. And let's not forget the role of individual agency in all this. Leaders like Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas and Rostam Farrakhzad weren't just faceless chess pieces. They were key players whose decisions and actions shaped the course of history. It's easy to oversimplify the Sasanian collapse as a clash of civilizations, but that narrative glosses over the complex tapestry of human motivations and mistakes that led to the empire's demise. So, what's left when an empire falls? More than you might think. The Sasanian legacy didn't just vanish like smoke in the wind. It left an indelible mark on the region and beyond. The administrative systems, cultural achievements, and even some aspects of the military organization were absorbed and adapted by the new Islamic rulers. It's a testament to the enduring influence of an empire that refused to be forgotten, even in its final hour. As the dust settled, the Sasanian Empire was no more, but its echoes would reverberate through history. From the architectural marvels of Persepolis to the philosophical works preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars, the influence of the Sasanians was like the ripples on a pond, continuing long after the initial splash had faded. The Sasanians may have lost their empire, but they left behind a rich tapestry of history, culture, and lessons that resonate to this day. As we wrap up this chapter, it's clear that the Sasanian Empire's fall was a complex tapestry of missteps, missed opportunities, and unforeseeable challenges. Yet, despite the collapse, the empire's legacy lived on, absorbed into the fabric of the burgeoning Islamic Caliphate and beyond. Stay tuned for the final installment, where we'll explore the enduring impact of the Sasanian legacy and how its echoes continue to shape the world today. The curtain may have fallen on the Sasanian Empire, but the echoes of its achievements were far from silent. Like a blockbuster movie whose influence lingers in pop culture, the Sasanians etched a legacy that the sands of time couldn't simply erase. As the Islamic Caliphate picked up the pieces, they found themselves inheriting more than just land. They acquired a treasure trove of Sasanian advancements in culture, science, and governance that would shape the future in ways few could have predicted. Let's start with medicine, because who doesn't love a little ancient healthcare innovation? The Academy of Gundishapur, nestled in what is now Iran, was the ancient world's version of a cutting-edge research hospital. Picture it as a bustling hub of scholars and physicians, exchanging ideas like they were trading Pokémon cards. By the 6th century, this place was already a melting pot of Greek, Indian, and Persian medical knowledge. It wasn't just a center of learning, it was a beacon of intellectual cross-pollination. The Sasanians weren't just patching people up, they were laying the groundwork for a medical revolution that would ripple through the Islamic Golden Age and beyond. Then there's astronomy. The Sasanians weren't just stargazers, they were the astronomers who laid down the celestial blueprints. Their astronomical tables, like the Zijai Shah, were the stuff of legend. These tables weren't just a bunch of numbers, they were precise calculations of celestial movements, the kind that could make modern astrologers weep with envy. Fast forward a few centuries, and you'll find the Islamic scholars poring over these tables, refining them, and passing them along to Europe. If you've ever marveled at the night sky and wondered how we got here, take a moment to thank the Sasanians for their cosmic contributions. But oh, the romanticized notion of the Sasanians' demise. It's the historical equivalent of a tearjerker movie where everyone leaves the theater dabbing their eyes. The reality, however, is a bit more sobering. The fall of the Sasanian Empire wasn't a grand, tragic finale. It was more like a slow-motion train wreck. Sure, the rise of the Islamic Caliphate played a crucial role, but let's not forget the empire's internal implosions. It was as if the Sasanians had set the stage for their downfall, and the Caliphate just happened to be the opening act. The social and political fabric of the empire was fraying long before the Arab forces arrived on the scene. Corruption ran rampant, power struggles were as common as dust storms, and the once mighty military was a shadow of its former self. It's tempting to paint the Sasanians as tragic heroes, undone by an unstoppable force, but let's be real. They were their own worst enemies. The romantic narrative of a noble empire crushed by external foes makes for a great story, but the truth is more akin to a cautionary tale of internal decay. Yet, even as the Sasanian Empire crumbled, its influence seeped into the very foundations of the burgeoning Islamic world. The administrative systems crafted by the Sasanians, efficient if you ignored the occasional bout of corruption, were too good to let go to waste. The Caliphate adopted and adapted these systems, streamlining governance in a way that would make any bureaucrat proud. The Sasanian tax system, for example, became the bedrock upon which the Islamic State built its financial structure. It's a testament to the Sasanians' enduring impact that their administrative legacy outlasted the empire itself. And let's not forget the cultural osmosis that occurred. The art and architecture of the Sasanian period left an indelible mark, influencing Islamic art for centuries to come. The grandiose palaces, the intricate carvings, the vibrant mosaics, these weren't just relics of a bygone era. They were a visual language that transcended the fall of an empire, leaving a lasting imprint on the aesthetic sensibilities of a new world order. The Sasanian legacy is like a ghost that refuses to be exorcised, haunting the annals of history with its achievements and failures. The empire's story is one of ambition, overreach, and ultimately resilience. It's a reminder that even in the face of collapse, the seeds of innovation and culture can take root and flourish in ways the original architects never imagined. So, as we wrap up this saga, what can we take away from the rise and fall of the Sasanian Empire? It's a tale of human endeavor in all its messy, glorious complexity. It teaches us that empires are built on the backs of dreamers and schemers alike, that innovation often thrives in the most unexpected places, and that the echoes of greatness can resonate long after the final curtain has fallen. The Sasanians may have exited the stage, but their legacy is a timeless encore, a reminder that history is never truly over. It's just waiting for its next act. The sun peeks over the horizon, casting a golden hue on the rugged stone walls that have stood proudly against time and tide. You're in a medieval castle, where the morning begins not with the gentle hum of an alarm clock, but with the clatter of iron-studded boots on flagstone corridors. This fortress isn't just a bundle of bricks. It's a living, breathing organism designed to keep invaders out and aristocratic life in full swing. Let's talk architecture. Those walls you see, they're not just for show. Built thick enough to withstand a siege, and towering high to repel even the most determined ladder climbers, these fortifications are the medieval version of a keep-out sign. The moat, often filled with water, is more than just a fancy wet ditch. It's a muddy, often stinky obstacle that turns any would-be invader's day into a soggy nightmare. And before you get to the castle's heart, you'd have to deal with the portcullis, a heavy iron grid that's basically a medieval do not disturb mechanism. Good luck getting past that without a battering ram. Now, once you're inside, the castle reveals its dual personality. It's both a war machine and a home sweet home. For the lord and his family, life here is a mix of luxury and utility. They live in the keep, the castle's central building, where stone walls keep them safe but make heating the place a Sisyphean task. Enter the grand hall, a communal area where meals are served and plans are hatched. You might imagine knights gallivanting about in shiny armor, but hold that thought. We'll get to them in a minute. Let's talk plumbing, or the medieval approximation of it. The garderobe, a charming name for a medieval toilet, is essentially a hole in the wall with a chute that deposits waste into the moat or a cesspit. Not exactly the height of hygiene, but it beats a chamber pot if you're on the higher floors. And when it comes to bathing, well, let's just say the medieval folks weren't big on daily showers. A yearly bath was more common for many, and that's if they were feeling particularly indulgent. Inside this stone giant, life buzzes with a hierarchy as rigid as the castle's walls. At the top, you've got the lord, the master of ceremonies, if you will. He's the one who calls the shots, from war strategies to who gets to marry off his daughter. His morning routine, probably less about gallant swordplay and more about managing estates and settling disputes. Then there's the lady of the castle, who runs the household, and despite what the tales say, likely spends more time managing accounts than embroidering in the solar. Now onto the knights, those supposed paragons of chivalry. Picture them less as the gleaming heroes of yore and more as the medieval equivalent of a freelance warrior. Their morning isn't a leisurely scroll through social media, but a regimented routine of prayer, weapon practice, and if they're lucky, breakfast. Knights are basically the castle's bouncers, sworn to protect, serve, and look dashing while doing it. Except, in reality, their armor's heavy, their pay's often late, and their code of chivalry tends to be more of a suggestion than a rule. Supporting this noble hierarchy are the castle's workers, the stewards like the CEO, running the day-to-day operations. Below him, you find cooks, falconers, blacksmiths, and the humble scullion, who spends the day knee-deep in dishwater. These folks keep the castle running smoothly, ensuring that when the Lord wants a roast boar, there's someone to make it happen. And then, there's you, navigating this world of stone and steel, where every archway tells a tale, and every battlement whispers secrets of a time when life was as gritty as the mortar between the stones. The castle is a microcosm of the medieval world, where the grand and the gritty coexist, and everyone, from the lord to the lowliest scullion, has a role to play in this living tapestry. So, as you wander through this fortress home, take in the sights, sounds, and smells of a day in the life of a medieval castle, where history isn't just something you read about, but something you live. So, as you wander through this fortress home, take in the sights, sounds, and smells of a day in the life of a medieval castle, where history isn't just something you read about, but something you live. Now, as your footsteps echo through the stone halls, you're about to step into the bustling heart of the castle, the kitchen and great hall. Prepare yourself for a sensory overload, because medieval cuisine was anything but bland, and the social hierarchy was as layered as a well-baked pie. Let's start with the kitchen, the medieval engine room, if you will. Here, the air is thick with the aroma of roasting meat and baking bread, a far cry from the modern kitchen with its electric stoves and sous vide machines. Picture a cavernous space filled with the clang of pots and the crackle of open fires. The kitchen staff, led by the master cook, operates like a well-oiled machine, chopping, stirring, roasting, and boiling. This isn't just cooking. It's a culinary ballet. Forget any notion that medieval folks subsisted on gruel and grey mush. The reality is their cuisine was surprisingly complex, especially for the well-heeled. The medieval palate was all about bold flavors. Spices like saffron, cinnamon, and ginger were the medieval equivalent of gold dust, often literally more expensive than their weight in silver. They came from trade routes that spanned continents, from the bustling markets of Constantinople to the spice islands of Asia, making these flavors a status symbol on the Lord's table. The economics behind this are as spicy as the dishes themselves. Spice merchants were the venture capitalists of their day, dealing in commodities that could make or break fortunes. Now, what's on the menu? If you're a lord, you're dining like a king, quite literally. Meals might feature venison, goose, or even swan. Yes, swan. Cooked with a delicate hand to impress the guests. But before you get too envious, remember, these feasts were more than just meals. They were power plays. A grand banquet was the medieval Facebook post, a public display of wealth, influence, and connections. The more lavish the spread, the more formidable the host appeared. Dining arrangements reflected the rigid social hierarchy. The lord and his family sat at the high table, quite literally elevated above the rest, a constant reminder of their status. For the everyday folk in the castle, meals were simpler yet still varied. Bread, ale, and pottage, a thick stew of vegetables and grains, were staples. But even here there was room for creativity. Herbs from the castle garden and the occasional piece of salted fish or pork added flavor. And let's not forget the seasons dictated what was on the table. Spring brought fresh greens, summer offered berries and fruits, autumn was the time for hearty stews, and winter, well, winter was all about surviving on what had been preserved. It was a culinary calendar marked by the rhythm of the land. But let's bust a myth or two. The idea that all medieval food was tasteless slop is just as misguided as thinking knights spent all day rescuing damsels in distress. The truth is, while the average peasant's diet was basic, it wasn't necessarily bland. And for the upper classes, the challenge wasn't just about acquiring food, but showing it off with flair. Medieval feasts were gastronomic spectacles where the line between chef and artist blurred. Elaborate dishes were crafted to look like mythical creatures or serve as tiny edible dioramas of the host's achievements. This brings us to the economic engine behind these culinary feats. Running a castle's kitchen was like managing a small country. The steward had to ensure a steady supply of ingredients, which meant overseeing everything from hunting expeditions to trade agreements. Importing spices or fine wines from afar required savvy negotiation and a keen eye on the accounts. If you think today's supply chain issues are a headache, try managing them with a quill and parchment. But let's not forget the social dynamics at play. The kitchen wasn't just a place for cooking, it was a hub of gossip and intrigue. Here, alliances were forged and broken, and information flowed as freely as the ale. The scullion, lowest in the pecking order, might overhear a whispered plan for a political coup while scrubbing pots, reminding us that history isn't just made in the throne room, but in the shadows of the hearth. As you move from the kitchen to the great hall, the epicenter of castle life, imagine long tables groaning under the weight of food, and the air filled with the chatter of conversation, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter or the clink of tankards. The great hall wasn't just for eating, it was where life unfolded. It was a courtroom, a dance floor, a theatre, and a place of diplomacy. Here the Lord would hold court, dispense justice, and negotiate alliances, all while keeping one eye on the roast beef. Dining in the great hall was a communal affair that reinforced the social pecking order. The Lord and his family sat at the top, of course, with their most trusted allies and guests. Below them, in descending order of importance, sat knights, squires, and other retainers. At the bottom, near the doors, were the servants and lower-ranking folks, a literal representation of their position in the castle's hierarchy. This seating arrangement wasn't just about who got the best cut of meat. It was a constant reminder of who held the power. In the midst of all this, the jester might perform, offering a bit of levity and a pointed commentary on the proceedings. The jester was more than just comic relief. He was the medieval truth-teller, able to speak truths others couldn't, all disguised as humor. His jokes might poke fun at the Lord's latest venture or the knight's less-than-stellar jousting skills, reminding everyone that even in the age of chivalry, no one was above a little roguish ribbing. As the meal wound down, the business of the day began. Plans were laid, disputes settled, and alliances forged, all over the remains of a banquet. It's here that the lines between personal and political blurred, where a shared meal could cement a treaty or spark a feud. So, as you take in this vibrant tableau, remember, the great hall was more than just a place to eat. It was the beating heart of the castle, where the social, political, and culinary threads of medieval life wove together in a tapestry of power, prestige, and occasional pandemonium. And as the echoes of the feast fade, they set the stage for the next chapter in this living history. Stay tuned, because the medieval world has only just begun to reveal its secrets. Speaking of secrets, let's dive into the political and military tapestry woven into the very stones of the medieval castle. If you thought life here was all about feasts and falcons, hold onto your chainmail, because the real game is far more cutthroat. The lord of the castle, our medieval CEO, wasn't just here for the banquets and occasional joust. Nope, his to-do list was longer than a dragon's tail, filled with duties that could make modern-day corporate executives break into a medieval sweat. His primary gig, managing his lands and maintaining his power. Sounds simple, right? Think again. This was a time when land equaled power, and power, well, that was the ultimate social currency. Managing these lands was not a one-man job. It was more like running a small kingdom. The lord had to oversee agriculture, resolve disputes, administer justice, and collect taxes. Imagine juggling all that while keeping an eye out for any potential usurpers. The lord's day wasn't filled with leisurely strolls through the orchard. It was a constant balancing act of diplomacy and authority. And speaking of diplomacy, this is where things get juicy. Marriages were less about romance and more about power consolidation. A strategic wedding could mean the difference between peace and war, or at the very least, an expanded territory. Now let's talk about castles and warfare, because what's a medieval tale without a bit of clashing swords and strategic cunning? These fortresses weren't just pretty stone boxes. They were military machines designed to withstand the chaos of battle. Strategically placed on hilltops or near important trade routes, castles were the medieval equivalent of a nuclear deterrent. Their imposing presence was a statement. Think twice before you mess with us. But let's debunk the myth of the impregnable fortress. The reality of medieval warfare was that no castle was entirely safe from a determined siege. Take the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215, for instance. King John, not exactly the poster boy for medieval kingship, laid siege to a rebellion-holding fortress. Despite its impressive defences, the castle fell after 2 months, thanks to the king's troops digging a tunnel under the walls and setting fire to the supports. Turns out, wood burns better than stone resists. Sieges were a test of endurance for both the besieged and the besiegers. Forget the Hollywood image of endless battles and daring rescues. Real sieges were often long, grueling affairs that could last months. The defenders hoped to outlast their attackers, while the attackers used every trick in the book, from starvation tactics to psychological warfare, to break the stalemate. It was a waiting game, and sometimes the side with the best logistics, not the sharpest swords, emerged victorious. The economics of warfare were as brutal as the battles themselves. Funding a siege was expensive business. A single siege tower could cost the equivalent of a small fortune, and maintaining an army wasn't cheap. Lords had to be resourceful, leveraging every ounce of political and economic capital to win. If you thought medieval warfare was just about brawn, think again. It was as much about brains and bank accounts. Political alliances were the chess moves behind the battlefield drama. Lords forged alliances through marriages and treaties, creating a web of obligations and loyalties. These alliances could shift like sand underfoot, turning friends into foes faster than you can say treason. The 100 Years' War between England and France was a prime example of how these alliances could set nations on a collision course. It was less about national identity and more about who had the stronger claim, better allies, and let's be honest, more money. And here's a spicy tidbit. The idea of noble chivalry often took a backseat when power was at stake. Loyalties were as flexible as a court jester's wit. Lords switched sides when it suited them, and betrayal was just another tool in the political toolbox. Remember, in the Game of Thrones, castles, it's not about who fights the hardest, but who plays the smartest. In this medieval dance of power, the castle stood as both a symbol and a tool. It was a statement of strength and a hub of strategy. Behind its walls, the lord maneuvered through the treacherous waters of medieval politics, using every resource at his disposal to maintain his dominion. It was a high-stakes game where the rewards were as great as the risks. So as you wander through these stone corridors, remember that every archway and arrow slit was part of a grand strategy. The castle was more than just a home. It was a fortress of power, a bulwark against the chaos of the medieval world, where alliances were forged and broken, and the fate of lands and people hung in the balance. And just as the echoes of swords on shields fade into the night, so too does our exploration of this world of stone and strategy. But don't pack your bags just yet. The medieval tapestry has more threads to unravel. We've only scratched the surface of this complex world where every stone has a story and every alliance a price. Stay tuned, because we're about to delve even deeper into the heart of medieval life and the secrets it still holds. As the echoes of swords on shields fade into the night, our journey through the medieval tapestry continues, this time with a focus on the cultural and religious pulse that beat at the heart of castle life. You might think of castles as stone fortresses bristling with swords and shields, but they were also sanctuaries of faith and culture, as vital to the soul as armor was to the body. First up, let's talk religion. In the medieval world, religion wasn't just a Sunday affair. It was the warp and weft of daily life. Every castle worth its salt had a chapel, a sacred space where the spiritual and the temporal worlds met. The chapel was more than just a place for whispered prayers and incense. It was the epicenter of the castle's moral cosmos. Here, the day often kicked off with a morning mass. Even if your attendance was more about social obligation than spiritual devotion, skipping service could earn you a one-way ticket to the rumor mill. The church was the medieval equivalent of Google, a source of knowledge, arbitration, and sometimes questionable advice. It wielded immense influence, shaping laws and education with a stroke of the quill. Here's a fun fact. Latin was the lingua franca of the church, and knowing it was like having the keys to the kingdom of knowledge. Priests doubled as educators, and the church's reach extended into the classroom, making sure that any learning was aligned with its doctrines. The medieval classroom might not have had smartboards or Wi-Fi, but it had something more enduring: the authority of the church. And let's not forget the legal muscle of the ecclesiastical courts. These weren't just for sorting out theological tiffs. They handled everything from marriage disputes to moral misdemeanors. Think of them as the medieval Judge Judy's, but with more robes and fewer commercial breaks. The church's influence was so pervasive that even kings were known to tread lightly around papal power. Remember Henry II and Thomas Becket. Their infamous clash ended with the king's penitent pilgrimage, proving that even the crown had to occasionally bend the knee to religious authority. Religion wasn't just about power plays and politics, though. It was deeply woven into the fabric of personal life. The medieval calendar was dotted with feast days and holy days, offering a welcome break from the grind of daily toil. These were times when the lines between the sacred and the secular blurred, and the castle community came together to celebrate with processions, plays, and, of course, feasting. Because what's a holy day without a good spread? Now let's pivot to the romanticized world of courtly love. The tales of knights and ladies, serenades under moonlit balconies, and love that transcends the ages. Cue the violins, right? Well, not so fast. The reality was a little less Shakespearean sonnet and a bit more medieval soap opera. Courtly love was a literary construct, a poetic ideal that often had more to do with social gamesmanship than actual romance. The concept of courtly love originated in the troubadour poetry of 12th century France. These travelling poets spun tales of unattainable love, where a knight would perform heroic deeds to win the favour of a noble lady, often married and thus out of reach. It was less about actual romance and more about elevating one's social standing through the art of flirtation and flattery. The love was unattainable, and that's what made it so tantalizing. A safe space to explore emotions without the messy reality of relationships. In practice, courtly love was a game with its own rules and rewards. It allowed knights to demonstrate their virtues, not just through martial prowess, but through wit and charm. And for noble women, playing the role of the unattainable muse was a way to wield influence in a world that often sidelined them. But let's not kid ourselves. The gap between the literary ideal and the gritty reality was often as vast as a castle moat. For all its poetic allure, courtly love rarely resulted in happily ever afters. Speaking of storytelling, enter the troubadours and minstrels, the original influencers. These wandering entertainers were the medieval CNN, spreading news and stories from castle to village and back again. With a lute in hand and a repertoire of songs, they regaled audiences with tales of heroism, love, and, occasionally, scandal. Their performances were the medieval equivalent of a viral TikTok video, short, engaging, and often with a moral twist. These performers were more than just purveyors of entertainment. They were cultural bridges, connecting isolated communities with the broader world. In an era before mass media, a minstrel's song could carry news of distant lands, royal decrees, or the outcome of a far-off battle. And let's not underestimate the role of gossip. A well-placed verse could boost a knight's reputation or ruin it, depending on the minstrel's mood or pocket change. Cultural exchange wasn't just a one-way street, though. Castles, despite their seemingly isolated existence, were melting pots of ideas and influences. Pilgrims, merchants, and diplomats passed through, each leaving a trace of their culture behind. A Byzantine envoy might introduce a new dance, while a returning crusader could bring back tales of the exotic East. Even the food on the Lord's table, spiced with saffron from the Levant or sugar from North Africa, was a testament to the castle's place in a web of global connections. So, as you wander through the afternoon shadows of our medieval fortress, remember that it was a world where faith and culture were as integral as stone and steel. The castle wasn't just a stronghold of power. It was a crucible of beliefs, stories, and traditions that shape the world within and beyond its walls. Stay tuned, because the echoes of this vibrant tapestry continue to weave their way through history, promising more tales to tell and secrets to uncover. As the sun dips below the horizon and shadows creep across the cobblestones, the castle begins its transformation from a bustling hive of daytime activity to a fortress of quiet vigilance. You might think that a medieval castle, with its thick walls and stout gates, would rest easy at night. But the truth is, evening in a castle is less like a serene bedtime story and more akin to a well-orchestrated security operation, complete with shifts, passwords, and the medieval equivalent of a neighborhood watch. First up, let's talk security measures because, believe it or not, the night watch wasn't just about a guard nodding off in a turret. Nope, this was serious business. Castles were the medieval version of a bank vault, and securing them was an art form. The portcullis, that fearsome iron grid, was lowered at dusk, sealing the main entrance like a giant medieval zipper. But that was just the start. Guards patrolled the walls, eyes sharp for any movement beyond the moat. Torches flickered along the battlements, casting eerie shadows that danced like spectres across the stones. The guards weren't just random muscle. They were often seasoned soldiers, some veterans of the Lord's campaigns. Their vigilance wasn't just about keeping out marauders, it was a statement of prestige. A well-guarded castle was a respected one, and the Lord's reputation hung in the balance. Plus, let's not forget the economic angle. Paying for a night watch wasn't cheap, so only the wealthier lords could afford a sizable, well-trained garrison. Imagine the medieval equivalent of a modern security system, but instead of cameras and alarms, you've got sharp-eyed men with swords and a penchant for the occasional boastful tale. As the castle settles into the rhythm of night, the great hall becomes a sanctuary of warmth and light. This is where the social dynamics shift and the evening gatherings begin. Picture a room alive with the glow of firelight, tapestries casting soft shadows on the walls, and the lingering scent of the evening feast. But this isn't just a post-dinner lounge. It's a microcosm of medieval society, where the day's hierarchies loosen ever so slightly, and the art of conversation takes center stage. Storytelling was the Netflix of the medieval world, minus the subscription fee. Every castle had its storytellers, sometimes professional minstrels, other times just a particularly eloquent lord or lady. Gathered around the fire, people exchanged tales of daring deeds, ghostly apparitions, and far-off lands. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were living history, oral traditions that preserved the past and shaped the future. The stories of knights and dragons might sound fantastical, but they often contained kernels of truth, weaving together fact and fiction in a way that kept listeners enthralled and informed. The role of storytelling was as much about preserving history as it was about reinforcing social norms and values. Through these tales, lessons about bravery, loyalty, and the pitfalls of hubris were passed down from generation to generation. It was a way to remember the past, and let's face it, a chance to embellish one's achievements. After all, a good story is only as good as the liberties taken with the truth. And while we're debunking myths, let's not overlook the fact that these tales often served as thinly veiled critiques of the powerful. A clever jibe hidden in a story could sway public opinion or curry favor, proving that words wielded power long before Twitter existed. And here's the kicker. The fascination with medieval life, with its tales of gallant knights and fair maidens, hasn't waned. We still romanticize this era despite, or perhaps because of, its gritty reality. The allure of stone castles and chivalric codes continues to capture our imagination, a testament to the enduring power of myth and legend. But let's strip away the rose-colored glasses for a moment. The reality of castle life was far more mundane and complex than the legends suggest. For every tale of heroism, there were days spent managing estates, resolving disputes, and ensuring survival through harsh winters. The truth is, life in a medieval castle was a delicate balancing act of power, politics, and practicality. It was a world where the lord's influence had to be constantly maintained, where the walls had to be fortified against both visible and invisible threats, and where the stories told at night held as much sway as the battles fought by day. The grandeur of a castle was tempered by the daily grind of maintaining it, a reminder that behind every legend lies a foundation of hard work and human endeavor. So, as you reflect on this intricate tapestry of medieval life, consider how the threads of myth and reality intertwine. The stories of yore, with their blend of fact and fiction, continue to resonate because they speak to the universal human experience. The quest for power, the fear of the unknown, the desire for legacy. In this way, the medieval castle stands as a monument not just to its time, but to the timeless nature of human ambition and creativity. And with that, we've reached the end of our journey through the stone corridors and storied halls of medieval castles. It's been a trip rich with intrigue, where every corner reveals a new facet of history's grand narrative. As the echoes of our exploration fade into the night, remember, the past is never truly bygone. It's alive in the stories we tell, the myths we create, and the histories we strive to understand. So keep questioning, keep exploring, and above all, keep the stories alive. Because in the end, it's the tales we tell that shape the world we live in. Once upon a time, in the not-so-sleepy coastal stretch of the eastern Mediterranean, lived the Phoenicians, those ancient overachievers who made even the Greeks do a double-take. Think of them like the Silicon Valley of the ancient world, only their innovations involved boats and an alphabet instead of apps and algorithms. The Phoenicians were the maritime maestros who mastered the art of seafaring long before it was cool. Their location was prime real estate, an oceanfront view that offered more than just pretty sunsets. We're talking about the kind of strategic placement that would make modern real estate developers drool. Sandwiched between the bustling civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia, with a front-row seat to the Mediterranean. Now, let's talk geography. The Phoenician heartland was a sliver of land where modern-day Lebanon lounges, with principal cities like Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and Arwad. These cities were like a string of pearls along the coast, each offering its own unique flair to the Phoenician crown. Tyre, for instance, was the Bay-and-Say of the bunch, undoubtedly the star, with a network of colonies stretching as far as Carthage in North Africa. Sidon, always in Tyre's shadow, was that reliable sidekick everyone needs, while Byblos was the historic heart, deeply tied to the ancient trade of papyrus. Geographically speaking, the Phoenicians had the perfect setup for a thriving trade empire. They didn't just sit pretty on the coast, they knew how to work it. Their cities were natural harbors, providing safe havens for their legendary fleets. And what fleets they were! These weren't your average rowboats. We're talking about ships that would make Poseidon himself nod in approval. The Phoenicians were shipbuilding savants, crafting vessels that could withstand the Mediterranean's mood swings, from gentle breezes to tempestuous storms. Their ships were the Ferraris of the ancient seas, equipped with innovations like the keel and the bireme design, which featured 2 rows of oars for extra speed and maneuverability. But the Phoenicians weren't just about boats. They had another ace up their sleeve, the creation of the alphabet. Move over, hieroglyphs and cuneiform. Here comes a writing system that won't leave you scratching your head. Around 1050 BCE, the Phoenicians developed an alphabet that consisted of 22 characters, each representing a consonant sound. It was simple, efficient, and most importantly, portable. This was the original less is more when it came to writing, and it spread like wildfire across the Mediterranean. Greek and Latin scripts owe a tip of the hat to these linguistic trailblazers. Now, let's dive into their trade networks. The Phoenicians weren't just good at navigating the seas, they were exceptional at navigating economies. Their trade routes were the veins pumping goods and wealth throughout the Mediterranean. They exchanged everything from the mundane to the mysterious. Timber from the cedar forests of Lebanon, glass, purple dye from murex snails, because who doesn't love a good splash of color? And intricately crafted jewelry. They were also known for trading wine, olive oil, and salted fish. The mundane, sure, but these staples were the bread and butter of ancient commerce. The Phoenicians weren't just traders, they were cultural conduits, spreading ideas, technologies, and styles as they sailed. Their ships were the hyperlinks of the ancient world, connecting diverse cultures and facilitating the flow of knowledge. But let's not romanticize too much. For all their achievements, the Phoenicians weren't above a little piracy and smuggling when the opportunity arose. After all, trade wasn't just about goods. It was about survival, power, and sometimes a bit of skullduggery. So, how did they do it? How did they build this vast network that spanned from the coasts of Spain to the shores of Lebanon? The answer lies in their adaptability and keen understanding of the geopolitical landscape. They weren't looking to conquer, they just wanted to do business. They established colonies in strategic locations, such as Carthage, which became a powerhouse in its own right. These colonies served as pit stops for their fleets, ensuring their trade networks remained robust and resilient. The Phoenicians understood that in a world dominated by empires with big armies and even bigger egos, it was better to be the indispensable middleman than the overextended conqueror. Their trade networks were a testament to the power of commerce over conflict, proving that sometimes the pen, or in this case, the shipping manifest, really is mightier than the sword. In the end, the Phoenicians were the unsung heroes of ancient history, masters of the sea, innovators of the written word, and architects of a trade network that laid the groundwork for future empires. They showed us that sometimes the most powerful legacy isn't an empire of land, but an empire of ideas and connections. So, the next time you send a text message or jot down a note, give a little nod to the Phoenicians, those ancient navigators of both ocean waves and cultural currents. And speaking of those Phoenician navigators, let's get down to the nitty-gritty of their trade networks. Picture the Mediterranean Sea as a bustling freeway, minus the traffic jams, but with plenty of salty spray and the occasional pirate attack. The Phoenicians were the ultimate road warriors of this maritime expressway, charting routes that spanned from the coasts of the Levant all the way to the Iberian Peninsula and beyond. Now, what exactly were these ancient mariners peddling across the waves? Let's start with the Tyrian purple dye, the ancient world's answer to Gucci and Prada. This wasn't just any color, it was the shade of royalty, quite literally. Extracted painstakingly from the murex snail, it took about 12,000 of these little critters to produce just 4 grams of dye. Talk about high maintenance. The end result was a vibrant, long-lasting purple that adorned the robes of emperors and kings, a symbol of status that screamed, "I have arrived." It wasn't cheap either. A pound of this dye could set you back the equivalent of thousands of dollars today. So, if you thought your designer jeans were pricey, think again. But the Phoenicians weren't just about flaunting their fashion sense. They had an entire catalogue of goods that kept their ships laden and their coffers full. Cedar timber, for example, was their bread and butter, a resource so prized that even the Egyptians, who weren't exactly short on woodcraft skills, imported it for their temples and ships. Then there was glass, another Phoenician specialty. They were among the first to mass-produce it, and they knew how to spin it into everything from practical containers to luxury items. Their trade routes were as varied as their merchandise. They established colonies like Gadia, modern-day Cadiz, in Spain, which served as a crucial outpost for accessing precious metals like silver and tin. These metals were the lifeblood of the Bronze Age economy, essential for weaponry and tools, and the Phoenicians knew exactly where to find and trade them. The Carthaginians, their descendants, would famously continue this tradition, becoming the titans of trade in their own right. The Phoenicians also had their hands in the grain trade, sailing to Egypt to barter for its abundant harvests. Grain was the staple of ancient diets, and having control over its distribution was akin to holding a modern-day oil pipeline. And let's not forget the wine and olive oil, those liquid luxuries that flowed as freely as the Mediterranean tides themselves. Why did these goods matter so much, you ask? Because they were the currency of cultural exchange, the stuff of social gatherings and religious ceremonies, and the fuel for economies both big and small. But let's not sugarcoat things. While the Phoenicians were brilliant traders, not every deal was a win-win. There were instances where their transactions were less about mutual benefit and more about opportunism. Think of it as the ancient version of a bad eBay deal. For instance, while they were happy to trade for precious metals, they weren't above offloading shoddy goods in exchange. It's said that they sometimes used cheap tin alloy passed off as pure products, a classic Bedtime switch that would make even a modern con artist proud. The economics of Phoenician trade were complex, a high-stakes game that required sharp wits and even sharper tongues. Their success hinged on their ability to navigate not just physical seas, but the turbulent waters of political diplomacy. They had to maintain good relations with the powers that be, whether it was the Egyptians or the Babylonians, ensuring that their ships could sail without hindrance. This often meant paying tribute or forging strategic alliances, a delicate dance of power and politics that required the agility of a trapeze artist. And here's a fun fact. The Phoenicians might have been among the first to employ what we now call brand loyalty. Their goods were in such demand that they became synonymous with quality, a reputation that allowed them to charge a premium. This wasn't just about economics. It was about creating an identity, a brand that transcended borders and languages. So, as we wrap up this leg of our journey through the Phoenician trade networks, remember that these ancient merchants were more than just traders. They were the original influencers, shaping economies, cultures, and even the very fabric of society. They showed us that commerce isn't just about the exchange of goods, but the exchange of ideas, a testament to the enduring power of trade in shaping human history. And with that, we leave the story open, ready to dive further into the complexities and contradictions of this fascinating civilization in our next installment. Stay tuned for more tales from the ancient seas. And as we dive back into the salty spray of the ancient seas, let's shift our gaze from the bustling trade routes to the intricate tapestry of politics and society that the Phoenicians wove around themselves. Picture them as the original social media mavens, only their platforms were the docks of Tyre and Sidon, and their followers were kings and emperors, not tick-tock teens. The Phoenicians, those savvy seafarers, weren't just moving goods. They were navigating the treacherous waters of diplomacy and influence, playing chess on a board where everyone else was playing checkers. First off, let's talk about their knack for alliances. In a time when your neighbors could be your best trading partners or your worst enemies, the Phoenicians were like the Switzerland of the ancient world, neutral, yet indispensable. They had a knack for making friends in high places, and their little black book of contacts was the envy of the Mediterranean. Take Egypt, for instance. The Egyptians were no strangers to power plays, and they didn't just see the Phoenicians as traders, but as essential allies in the game of thrones that was ancient geopolitics. The Phoenicians supplied Egypt with cedar wood, a resource as precious as gold when it came to building ships and monumental architecture. In return, they got not only grain to sustain their cities, but also political backing that turned their coastal strip into a place of relative peace amidst a sea of turmoil. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The Phoenicians' relationship with Assyria was a different kettle of fish. You see, the Assyrians weren't exactly known for their charm. They were more about swords and scorched earth. Yet the Phoenicians managed to walk a tightrope, paying tribute to keep the Assyrian war machine at bay while continuing their trading escapades. It's a bit like paying off the schoolyard bully to keep your lunch money, but still managing to run a successful lemonade stand on the side. And boy, did they run it well. This delicate balance of power allowed them to maintain their autonomy, a remarkable feat considering the region's constant shifts in power dynamics. Now, let's bust a few myths that have floated around like driftwood over the centuries. The Phoenicians have often been painted as crafty traders who'd sell their own grandmother for a quick profit, an image that's more caricature than fact. Sure, they were shrewd, but they were also astute diplomats, understanding that long-term relationships were more valuable than short-term gains. They didn't just barter goods. They exchanged culture and knowledge, acting as the Mediterranean's cultural ambassadors. This wasn't just about making a sale, it was about building a legacy. Their reputation as master negotiators wasn't just hearsay. Historical records, such as those from Byblos, a city that had been a hub of trade with Egypt since the 3rd millennium BCE, highlight how Phoenician kings adeptly managed diplomatic relations, ensuring their cities thrived under various foreign dominions. These guys were the original spin doctors, turning potentially hostile takeovers into mutually beneficial partnerships. It's no wonder they were often viewed with a mix of admiration and suspicion. Let's not forget the social fabric of Phoenician society, which was as colorful as the Tyrian purple they so famously traded. These weren't just merchants. They were citizens of a complex urban culture that valued learning and innovation. Their cities were bustling centers of commerce and culture, where ideas flowed as freely as goods. It's said that the Phoenicians were among the first to establish libraries, collecting texts from across their trading network, a sort of ancient Google, if you will, where knowledge was as prized as gold. But let's not romanticize too much. The Phoenicians, like any great civilization, were a study in contradictions. For every tale of diplomatic prowess, there's a story of underhanded dealings. They weren't above playing both sides when it suited them, a strategy that sometimes backfired spectacularly. Their alliances with powerful neighbors often came at a cost, binding them to the whims of empires whose interests didn't always align with their own. Yet, through it all, the Phoenicians retained a remarkable degree of independence. They were neither conquerors nor conquered, but something in between, a rare status that allowed them to thrive for centuries. Their influence was felt far beyond their borders, shaping the political landscape of the ancient world in ways that are still being unpacked by historians today. So, as we continue to sail through the annals of Phoenician history, let's remember that they were more than just traders. They were the architects of an interconnected world, where commerce and diplomacy were two sides of the same coin. Their story is one of adaptability and resilience, a testament to the power of trade not just to move goods, but to move boundaries and shape civilizations. And with that, we leave the tale open, ready to explore more of their legacy in the chapters to come. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the Phoenician world, where the next revelation is just a wave away. So, as we continue to sail through the annals of Phoenician history, we find ourselves staring down the barrel of their inevitable decline, a tale as old as time, or at least as old as civilization. The Phoenicians, those crafty seafarers who once ruled the waves, found themselves caught in the crosshairs of history, their fate sealed by forces far beyond their control. It turns out that being the middleman of the Mediterranean wasn't all smooth sailing. Let's dive into the tempest that led to their fall, shall we? First up, let's talk about the rise of competing powers. By the time the 6th century BCE rolled around, the Phoenicians weren't the only game in town. Enter the Greeks, the new kids on the block with a hunger for trade and a knack for naval prowess. The Greeks weren't content with playing second fiddle to the Phoenicians, and they quickly started muscling into their trade routes, setting up their own colonies along crucial maritime paths. It was like watching a new tech startup disrupt an established giant, only with more triremes and fewer tech bros. Then came the Persians, sweeping in with the force of a desert storm. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great, the Persian juggernaut, conquered Babylon, and soon the Phoenician cities found themselves under Persian control. But hey, at least the Persians were more about bureaucracy than brutality, right? Under Persian rule, Phoenicia was absorbed into the vast empire, becoming a satrapy, a fancy term for a province. They still traded, but now they had to pay tribute to the Persians, effectively becoming a cog in the imperial machine. It was like going from being your own boss to working for a multinational corporation, complete with all the red tape and annual performance reviews. The Persian takeover was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it meant protection from the marauding armies of the time, but on the other, it came with strings attached. The Phoenicians were still trading, sure, but now they were sharing the profits with their Persian overlords, which takes a bit of the fun out of being a trade tycoon. Their famed independence was now more of a fond memory than a current reality, a bit like a retired rock star reminiscing about the glory days. But it wasn't just external pressures that did the Phoenicians in. Internal strife played its part too. The once unified cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos began to bicker and squabble like siblings fighting over the last piece of cake. Their famous cooperation started to unravel, and without a united front, they were easy pickings for the empires that surrounded them. This internal discord was like termites in the foundation of their trade empire, slowly but surely eating away at their strength. And then there were the changing trade winds, both literally and metaphorically. Literally speaking, climate change might have played a role. Some scholars suggest that shifts in wind patterns and sea currents made the Mediterranean a more treacherous place to do business. Suddenly, those natural harbors weren't looking so safe. Metaphorically, the trade winds were shifting towards new centers of power. Carthage, a Phoenician colony that had grown into a powerhouse of its own, began to take the spotlight, leaving the original cities in the dust. It's like watching your protege become the next big thing while you're stuck in a rut, wondering where it all went wrong. But let's not sugarcoat things. The Phoenicians didn't exactly adapt like chameleons to these new realities. Their reluctance to innovate beyond their tried-and-true methods made them sitting ducks in a rapidly changing world. They were like the blockbuster of the ancient world, stubbornly clinging to their VHS tapes while everyone else moved on to streaming services. And yet, for all their eventual decline, the Phoenicians left a legacy that echoed through the ages. Their alphabet, that ingenious system of writing, became the foundation for Greek and Latin scripts, the very building blocks of Western civilization. Even as their cities fell into obscurity, their innovations in shipbuilding and navigation continued to influence maritime technology for centuries. It's a bit like how the floppy disk, despite being obsolete, lives on as the universal symbol for saving a document. The Phoenicians faded from the forefront, but their contributions endured, a testament to their ingenuity and lasting impact. So, what happened to their cities? Well, Tyre, that once glittering jewel, faced a series of sieges, most notably by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, who famously built a causeway to breach its defenses. Talk about determination. Sidon and Byblos, meanwhile, became shadows of their former selves, overshadowed by new powers. Yet their stories didn't end in total obscurity. These cities continued as regional centers, their histories woven into the fabric of the cultures that succeeded them. It's a reminder that even in decline, there's a certain dignity in endurance. As we leave the Phoenicians on the cusp of history's horizon, it's clear that their story is one of both triumph and tragedy, a narrative as complex as the sea they once ruled. In the grand tapestry of history, they were the threads that connected empires, the links that forged civilizations. Their decline was not an end, but a transformation, a passing of the torch to new players on history's stage. And with that, we prepare to set sail once more, ready to explore the next chapter of this ancient saga. Stay tuned, because the story is far from over. There's more to uncover, more to question, and more to marvel at in the ever-turning wheel of history. So, as we prepare to sail into the sunset of Phoenician history, let's pause to marvel at how their legacy still casts a long shadow over our world today. The Phoenicians weren't just traders. They were cultural architects, and their innovations laid the foundation for what we could call the first global economy. Imagine a time when trade routes stretched like a web across the known world, connecting distant lands in a dance of commerce and culture. The Phoenicians were the master choreographers of this dance, and their influence is undeniable. Let's talk navigation. Before GPS and Google Maps, there were the Phoenicians, charting the Mediterranean with nothing more than the stars and their wits. They were the first to use the North Star as a guide, an innovation that turned the open sea from a terrifying expanse into a highway of opportunity. These guys weren't just surviving the seas, they were thriving, turning the Mediterranean into their personal racetrack. They were the original globetrotters, journeying to the far corners of the world as they knew it, trading goods, swapping stories, and spreading ideas like ancient influencers. Their navigation skills weren't just about getting from point A to point B, they were about opening new pathways for cultural exchange, spreading knowledge and ideas as they went. Picture this. A Phoenician ship docks in a foreign port, laden with goods from distant lands. But it wasn't just timber and textiles that disembarked. Along with their cargo came stories, languages, and ideas that would ripple through time, influencing societies long after the ships had sailed away. It's like a mixtape of cultures, with the Phoenicians as the eclectic DJs spinning tracks from around the world. And let's not forget their alphabet. In a world dominated by complex scripts that were more art than communication, the Phoenicians introduced a writing system that was as revolutionary as it was simple. Just 22 characters made up their alphabet, each representing a consonant sound. This wasn't just a linguistic leap, it was a democratization of knowledge. Suddenly, writing was accessible, a tool for everyone, not just the elite scribes. It's no exaggeration to say that without the Phoenician alphabet, we might not have the rich tapestry of written history that we enjoy today. The Greeks adapted it, the Romans further refined it, and eventually it evolved into the scripts we use now. If you've ever dashed off a quick note or typed out a text message, you've got the Phoenicians to thank for making it so straightforward. But with great legacy comes great mythos, and the Phoenicians are no strangers to that. Over the centuries, they've been cast as everything from noble traders to unscrupulous merchants, their story twisted and turned by the whims of history. Why do these myths persist? Perhaps it's because we love a good story, and the Phoenicians' tale is ripe with intrigue and adventure. They're the ancient world's enigmatic underdogs, the outsiders who carved out a niche amidst towering empires. Their story is a narrative goldmine, a blend of fact and fiction that captures the imagination. Take the myth of their insatiable greed, for instance. Popular lore paints them as mercenaries of the marketplace, driven solely by profit. But in reality, their trade was as much about survival as it was about riches. In a region where land was scarce and resources limited, trade was a lifeline, not just for economic gain, but for cultural vitality. They were pragmatic, yes, but they were also visionaries, understanding that wealth wasn't just measured in gold and silver, but in the richness of ideas and connections. And then there's the legend of their mysterious disappearance. Some say the Phoenicians simply vanished, swallowed by the tides of history. In truth, their decline was a slow fade rather than an abrupt exit, a testament to the complex forces at play in the ancient world. The rise of new powers, shifting trade routes, and internal strife all played a part in their downfall. But even as their cities fell into obscurity, their influence lingered, woven into the fabric of the civilizations that followed. So, what does this say about us, our fascination with these ancient mariners? Perhaps it's because the Phoenicians embodied a spirit of exploration and innovation that resonates even today. In a world where the next frontier is always just beyond the horizon, their story is a reminder of the power of curiosity and the courage to venture into the unknown. They were the pioneers of a global mindset, a philosophy that still drives us as we navigate our own interconnected world. As we wrap up this journey through Phoenician history, it's clear that their legacy is more than just a footnote in the annals of time. They were the trailblazers of trade, the architects of communication, and the cultural conduits of the ancient world. Their story is a tapestry of triumphs and trials, a narrative as rich and varied as the goods they once traded. And though the waves of history may have washed over their cities, their influence endures, a testament to the enduring power of trade and the human spirit. So next time you find yourself marveling at the wonders of globalization or the mysteries of the past, remember the Phoenicians. Those ancient navigators of both ocean and culture have left a legacy that continues to shape our world in ways both subtle and profound. Their story is a reminder that even the smallest nations can leave the largest footprints, their echoes resonating through time, whispering tales of adventure, innovation, and the indomitable human drive to connect and create. In the bustling streets of Warsaw in 1867, a baby girl named Maria Skłodowska was born into a world that hadn't quite caught up with her potential. Her family, well-educated but financially strained, might have had an inkling of her future brilliance, but society had other plans. Back then, Poland was under the thumb of the Russian Empire, which meant that education, particularly for women, was less about nurturing genius and more about teaching them to cross-stitch their dreams into a tidy domestic life. But Maria, or Marie, as the world would come to know her, had other ideas. Marie's childhood was a study in contrast, a family that valued knowledge yet had the financial resources of a particularly undernourished church mouse. Her father, W. Ladislaw, was a physics teacher who probably had more equations than zlotys in his pocket. Despite the economic challenges, he filled their home with books and scientific instruments, kindling a fire in Marie that no amount of societal damp blankets could extinguish. Growing up, Marie was the kind of kid who would rather solve a math problem than play with dolls, which, let's be honest, probably made her the least popular girl at tea parties. But her early schooling in a clandestine, flying university, an underground institution for women, was where she first tasted the forbidden fruit of higher education. This secret school was like the Hogwarts for the scientifically inclined, only with more calculus and fewer broomsticks. It was here that Marie developed a passion for science that would one day revolutionize our understanding of the atom. Now, let's bust a myth before it gets its boots on. Marie wasn't a child prodigy. She didn't emerge from the womb with a lab coat and a periodic table. Her genius was a slow burn, fueled by relentless curiosity and an ironclad work ethic. The legend of the genius child is appealing, sure, but it's as realistic as finding a unicorn in your backyard. Marie's achievements were the result of sweat, tears, and a stubborn refusal to let a little thing like societal norms get in her way. By the time she reached her late teens, Marie was itching to break free from the constraints of her environment like a butterfly with a pH. Her dreams needed room to breathe, and Warsaw's educational opportunities were about as expansive as a shoebox. But Paris was a different story. The City of Light was the mecca of scientific inquiry, and Marie was determined to bask in its glow. In 1891, Marie made her way to Paris, a journey that was less about romance and more about academic salvation. The trip itself was no small feat. We're talking about an almost 1,600-kilometer trek with the kind of resources that would make a shoestring look like a yacht. She enrolled at the Sorbonne, where she was one of just 23 women among 1,825 students. If you're doing the math, that's about 1%, a percentage more commonly associated with milk than gender representation in education. Once in Paris, Marie immersed herself in her studies like a duck to water, or in her case, like a scientist to a beaker. She lived in a tiny attic room, subsisting on little more than bread and tea, a diet that, while not exactly Michelin-starred, allowed her to focus on her research. It was a Spartan existence, but it was one she embraced with tenacity. Her academic rigor paid off when she graduated first in her class in physics in 1893 and second in math the following year, proving that while she may not have been a prodigy, she was undoubtedly a force of nature. Marie's journey to Paris was not just a geographical relocation, but a seismic shift in her life's trajectory. She had left behind the oppressive educational restrictions of Poland and stepped into a world where her intellect could flourish. Yet, even in the enlightened corridors of the Sorbonne, she faced the cold shoulder of gender bias. Despite her groundbreaking work, many of her male colleagues would have sooner seen a dog enrolled in their classes than a woman. Marie, however, didn't just break the glass ceiling. She smashed it with a radioactive sledgehammer. While her early life might not have had the dramatic flair of a Hollywood biopic, it was marked by a quiet determination and a relentless pursuit of knowledge. Marie Curie's story reminds us that genius is often less about lightning strikes and more about the persistent drip of water wearing away the rock of ignorance. And as she settled into her new life in Paris, little did the world know that this tenacious Polish woman was on the brink of discoveries that would change the very fabric of science itself. So here we are, standing at the brink of Marie Curie's scientific revolution. She's navigating the testosterone-infused halls of the Sorbonne, where her brilliance is both a beacon and a target. Enter Pierre Curie, a man who, unlike many of his contemporaries, saw Marie not as an anomaly, but as an intellectual equal. They met in 1894, And if you're expecting tales of love at first sight, think again. This wasn't a romance novel with lab coats. It was the meeting of two kindred scientific spirits. Pierre, a physicist with a penchant for piezoelectricity, try saying that 3 times fast, was not your average academic. He was more comfortable in the world of atoms and molecules than in the drawing rooms of Parisian society. When Marie came along, speaking the language of science with the fluency of a native, it was like finding a long-lost partner who also happened to be a genius. Their partnership wasn't built on candlelit dinners, but on shared notebooks and late-night debates over atomic weights. Let's shatter a myth right here. Marie and Pierre were not science's Bonnie and Clyde, stealing through the night with test tubes and Geiger counters. They were, however, a power couple in the truest sense, challenging conventions and pushing the boundaries of what was known about the natural world. Their laboratory, not quite the sleek, high-tech facility you might imagine. Instead, picture a dilapidated shed that had seen better days, perhaps before the French Revolution. It wasn't much to look at, but it was in this unassuming space that the Curies would make discoveries that would illuminate the darkness, literally. Now let's talk economics, because the Curie lab was exactly the financial powerhouse of the scientific world. Initially, their budget was about as robust as a wet paper towel. The shed they worked in was so poorly insulated that in winter their breath would freeze in midair, a special effect not even Hollywood could replicate. The Curies were the MacGyvers of their time, making do with old equipment and whatever scraps of material they could scrounge together. Their resources were so scarce that they could have used a Kickstarter campaign more than a century before it was a thing. Despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, the Curies were relentless. Their discovery of radium and polonium was not an overnight success, but the result of years of painstaking research. They processed tons of pitchblende, literally tons, as in 10,000 kilograms, just to extract a speck of radium. Imagine mining for gold and finding a single flake after moving a mountain. It was a Herculean task, made even more impressive when you consider that they did it while juggling teaching commitments and the occasional bout of pneumonia from their drafty lab. You might wonder what drove them to such extremes. Was it fame, fortune, or the allure of a Nobel Prize? Not quite. For the Curies, it was pure scientific curiosity, an insatiable desire to understand the fundamental building blocks of the universe. When Marie and Pierre discovered radium in 1898, it wasn't just another element on the periodic table. It was a key to unlocking the mysteries of radioactivity, a term that Marie herself coined. And polonium, named after Marie's homeland as a defiant nod to Polish nationalism under Russian oppression. Talk about making a statement with your scientific work. The economic sacrifices the Curies made were not just a footnote, they were a central theme of their story. While their discovery sparked a revolution in medical science, the financial returns were, shall we say, less than revolutionary. They famously refused to patent their radium extraction methods, a decision that left them scrambling for research funds even as the world reaped the benefits. In a world where intellectual property is now a billion-dollar industry, this act of selflessness is both noble and, let's face it, a tad naive. But before we paint them as martyrs, let's appreciate their pragmatism. The Curies were well aware of the economic realities, yet their focus remained steadfastly on advancing human knowledge. It's a cliché to say they did it for the love of science, but in this case, it's also the truth. Their work laid the foundation for countless advances, from cancer treatments to atomic energy, proving that sometimes the greatest dividends aren't measured in currency, but in the breadth of human understanding. As Marie and Pierre navigated the treacherous waters of academia, they were reshaping not just their own lives, but the future of science itself. Their story isn't just one of discovery, but of defiance, against economic constraints, societal norms, and the very laws of nature. And while it's tempting to romanticize their journey as a golden age of scientific exploration, the truth is far more gritty. Their achievements were carved out of hardship and relentless perseverance, a testament to what can be achieved when passion meets purpose. With every gram of radium they isolated, the Curies not only illuminated the path for future scientists, but also cast a long shadow over the myths that would later envelop their story. As we leave them in their shed, huddled over their experiments, let's not forget the real alchemy here wasn't in turning base metal into gold, but in transforming the raw elements of the earth into the building blocks of a new scientific era. Their story is far from over, and as we move forward, the next chapter promises even more revelations, both in the lab and in the world they helped shape. As the Curies toiled away in their drafty shed, the world outside was slowly waking up to the seismic shift their discoveries heralded. Marie Curie, with her discovery of radium and polonium, wasn't just fiddling around with glowing rocks. She was redefining the very concept of matter itself. Radioactivity, the term she coined, was the new kid on the scientific block, and it was ready to shake things up more than any earthquake ever could. Let's get into the nitty-gritty here. Radioactivity, at its core, was the realization that atoms, those solid, unbreakable units of matter, were not so solid after all. They could spontaneously emit energy, transforming into different elements in the process. This was revolutionary, like discovering that your trusty old wristwatch could also double as a time machine. Marie and Pierre were pioneers, with Marie taking the helm in coining the term that would become the bedrock of nuclear physics. But before we get too carried away with accolades, let's remember this was no walk in the park. The Curies' dedication to their work came with a price tag that would make even the most reckless gambler wince. Health risks. Oh, they had that in spades. We're not just talking about a few sniffles here. Exposure to radioactive materials is the kind of thing that makes a sunburn seem like a pleasant tan. The Curies were handling radium with the kind of casualness usually reserved for handling bread dough, blissfully unaware of the long-term dangers lurking in their glowing discoveries. Marie herself suffered from chronic illness, a rather rude consequence of prolonged exposure to radiation. Nausea, fatigue, and a plethora of other symptoms were her constant companions, a grim reminder that not all that glitters is gold. Sometimes it's radium, and it's downright dangerous. This wasn't just Marie's cross to bear. Pierre, too, felt the toll. His untimely death in 1906 was a tragic blow, though it came not from radioactivity, but from a freak accident involving a horse-drawn carriage. In a bitter twist of fate, it was the mundane that claimed him, not the glittering spectre of their scientific endeavors. Yet even as she mourned Pierre, Marie's work continued to shine. The Nobel Prizes rolled in like clockwork. Well, not quite like clockwork, but certainly in a way that suggested the world was finally catching on to the magnitude of her contributions. Marie snagged her first Nobel Prize in physics in 1903, sharing it with Pierre and Henry Becquerel. This was no small potatoes. Back then, the 150,782 Swedish krona prize was roughly equivalent to a couple of $1 million today. But the Curies' financial woes didn't just evaporate overnight. Much of the prize money went back into their research because Marie was less about the cash and more about the quest. Fast forward to 1911, and Marie was at it again, this time bagging a solo Nobel Prize in chemistry for her discovery of radium and polonium. A second Nobel. Now that's what I call a comeback tour. Not only was she the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, but she was also the first person to win two in different fields. Eat your heart out, overachievers of the world. But let's not gloss over the economic context here. Marie's research was groundbreaking, yet her financial situation often bordered on the precarious. The scientific community, while quick to applaud her achievements, was less forthcoming with the resources she desperately needed. You'd think the person who unlocked the secrets of the atom would have a slightly easier time securing funding. But no, Marie's story was as much about financial struggle as it was about scientific triumph. And speaking of struggles, Marie's personal life was far from a fairy tale. Widowed, overworked, and often unfairly criticized, she faced a barrage of public scrutiny, particularly when it came to her private life. Her relationship with fellow scientist Paul Langevin, for instance, was tabloid fodder before tabloids were even a thing. The scandal was the kind of story that would make for a great Netflix series today, complete with love letters, betrayal, and a public trial by media. It was a harsh reminder that even scientific luminaries aren't immune to the glare of public judgment. But through it all, Marie remained undeterred. She was a force of nature, not just in the lab, but in the world of academia, where she fought for recognition and funding with the tenacity of a boxer in the final round. Her establishment of the Radium Institute in 1914 was a testament to her determination. This institution became a hub for nuclear research, a place where future generations of scientists could explore the mysteries she had first uncovered. Marie Curie's journey was one of resilience and relentless pursuit of knowledge, a story not just of discovery, but of defiance against the odds. Her legacy is a testament to the idea that true innovation often requires not just genius, but grit, a willingness to endure the hardships that come with breaking new ground. So, as we leave Marie in her Radium Institute, let's not forget the stark realities behind the glow of her achievements. Her story is far from over, and as we look to the future chapters, we'll see how her trailblazing work paved the way for the atomic age and the ethical dilemmas it brought. The next part promises even more revelations as we delve into the broader impact of her discoveries on science and society. Hold onto your Geiger counters, because the ride is far from over. As we leave Marie Curie in her Radium Institute, the world is on the brink of a seismic upheaval, not just in the lab, but on the battlefield. Enter World War I, a conflict so vast it made previous wars look like playground scuffles. With Europe embroiled in what was then known as the Great War, Marie's genius was about to find a new battlefield application. Forget glowing rocks. This was about saving lives with a new kind of glow. Now, you might think that Marie, the Nobel-winning scientist, would be content to sit this one out in her lab. But no. When war came knocking, she answered like a scientific superhero, ready to wield her powers for the good of humanity. The battlefield was a gruesome place, with injuries that were more horrific than the finest horror film makeup could conjure. Traditional medical practices were as outdated as a rotary phone, and the need for quick, efficient treatment was dire. Here's where Marie's brilliance comes into play. She saw the potential of X-rays, discovered just a couple of decades earlier, to revolutionize battlefield medicine. But there was one teeny-tiny problem. X-ray machines were about as mobile as a brick house. So Marie did what any ingenious problem solver would do. She put wheels on them. She developed mobile radiography units, affectionately dubbed Little Curies. And these units were about to do for medicine what smartphones did for communication. Make it portable and accessible. The logistics were no small feat. We're talking about the early 20th century, where roads were more pothole than pavement, and vehicles had the reliability of a paper umbrella in a hurricane. Yet Marie managed it with aplomb. She personally trained over 150 women as radiology technicians, the majority of whom had never seen an X-ray machine in their lives. Talk about a crash course. Her mobile units, powered by car batteries and driven by women volunteers, traveled to the front lines to provide on-the-spot diagnosis. It's a bit like Uber, but with a way more crucial purpose. The numbers don't lie. By the end of the war, over 1 million soldiers had been examined using these mobile units. That's not just impressive, it's game-changing. The ability to locate shrapnel, bullet fragments, and broken bones with precision meant that doctors could operate with the kind of accuracy previously reserved for a concert pianist's fingers. This innovation saved countless limbs and lives, turning battle scars into badges of survival rather than death sentences. But let's not sugarcoat it. This was grueling work, and it took a toll on Marie. She wasn't just running a lab. She was running a war effort. The economic strain was significant, too. Financing the production and maintenance of over 200 radiological installations across France wasn't a task for the faint-hearted or the financially challenged. Yet Marie persevered, often digging into her own pockets, which, let's be honest, were more like the pockets of jeans you buy on sale, practically non-existent. And here's the kicker. Despite her monumental contributions, Marie Curie received little recognition from the government for her wartime efforts. It's the kind of oversight that makes you want to shake the history books and demand a rewrite. While medals and accolades were handed out like candy to those whose contributions were more about strategy than saving lives, Marie quietly returned to her research after the war, her contributions to battlefield medicine largely unrecognized at the time. As the war ended and the dust settled, Marie faced yet another challenge: the post-war scientific community. Picture a room full of men, each with an ego as large as the Hindenburg, and Marie walking in with her now legendary achievements. If you think they rolled out the red carpet, think again. The scientific world was still very much a boys' club, and Marie was seen as a gatecrasher at best. Navigating this testosterone-fueled environment was no small task. But Marie was nothing if not tenacious. Her post-war work continued to push boundaries as she delved deeper into the mysteries of radioactivity. Yet, she had to fight tooth and nail for every scrap of funding and recognition. If you're wondering why she never patented her radium extraction method, it wasn't just about altruism. It was also about ensuring her work remained accessible and untainted by commercial interests. She wanted science to serve humanity, not profit margins. Despite the challenges, Marie's influence was undeniable. Her establishment of the Radium Institute became a beacon for future generations of scientists, male and female alike. She had carved out a space in a world that was as welcoming as a porcupine on a bad hair day. Her legacy was not just in her discoveries, but in the doors she opened for women in science, a legacy that continues to inspire. So, as we look back on Marie Curie's wartime contributions, it's clear that her story is one of resilience and ingenuity. She wasn't just a scientist. She was a pioneer in the truest sense, breaking new ground and defying the odds at every turn. Her work during World War was a testament to her belief that science should serve the greater good, a belief that continues to resonate in an age where technological advancements often outpace ethical considerations. And while the accolades may not have been as forthcoming as they should have been, Marie Curie's legacy remains indelible. She taught us that true innovation requires not just intelligence, but courage. The courage to challenge norms, to endure hardships, and to push forward even when the world seems determined to push back. As we wrap up this chapter of Marie's extraordinary life, let's leave some room for contemplation. The world she helped shape is one that continues to grapple with the implications of her discoveries, and the next parts of her story promise even more revelations. So hang tight, because the journey through the life and legacy of Marie Curie is far from over. As we gear up to explore the legacy of Marie Curie, let's take a step back and separate the woman from the mythic figure that history textbooks love to paint with a saintly glow. Marie Curie was no plaster saint. She was a trailblazer with a penchant for defying odds that would make even the most stubborn mule look cooperative. First off, let's talk numbers. Marie Curie's scientific achievements are often summarized in bullet points that read like a Nobel Prize checklist. But what do they really mean for the world today? Well, her work laid the groundwork for nuclear physics and chemistry, fields that continue to shape our modern lives in ways we often take for granted. We're talking about everything from cancer treatments to nuclear energy, a multi-billion-dollar industry that powers cities, and admittedly, gives us the occasional existential angst about mushroom clouds. And then there's her influence on women in STEM. In a world where less than 30% of researchers worldwide are women, Marie Curie's story is more than just inspirational, it's instructional. She didn't just break the glass ceiling. She shattered it with a radioactive hammer. Her 2 Nobel Prizes weren't just personal victories. They were a clarion call to women everywhere that intellect has no gender. Today, her name adorns scholarships, research institutes, and an element on the periodic table, curium, and homage not just to her brilliance, but to her resilience. But let's debunk some myths while we're at it. The sanitized narrative often presents Marie as a lone genius working in splendid isolation, a romantic notion that overlooks the complex realities of her life. Sure, she was a pioneer, but she was also a collaborative scientist who thrived in the company of peers. even if they were a bit slow to offer her a seat at the table. Her partnership with Pierre was not just a marriage, but a scientific collaboration of equals, a rarity in an era when women were often relegated to the role of assistant, or worse, distraction. Economically, Marie's life was far from a fairy tale. Despite her groundbreaking discoveries, she often found herself scraping together funds like a student trying to budget for both ramen and rent. Her refusal to patent her radium extraction method was a double-edged sword, an act of scientific altruism that left her financially strained, even as it paved the way for advances that others would profit from handsomely. Imagine discovering a cure for a major disease and then watching others rake in the billions because you decided to keep it open source. That's Marie's story in a nutshell. Let's not forget the societal challenges she faced, either. Marie lived in a world that was about as welcoming to women in science as a porcupine in a balloon shop. The gender bias she encountered was as pervasive as it was pernicious. The very act of her becoming a scientist was a form of rebellion, a defiance of societal norms that told women to stick to embroidery rather than electromagnetism. Yet she persevered, driven by a passion for discovery that transcended the barriers placed in her path. Her personal life, too, was far from the sanitized version often presented. The scandal involving her relationship with Paul Langevin was a stark reminder that even scientific icons aren't immune to the prying eyes of public judgment. The tabloids of the day went to town, painting her as a homewrecker rather than a human being with complex emotions and relationships. It's a narrative that feels all too familiar even today, where the lives of public figures are scrutinized under a microscope more intense than any she used in her lab. Yet, through it all, Marie Curie's legacy endures. She showed us that true innovation often requires not just a brilliant mind, but a courageous heart. Her life was a testament to the power of perseverance in the face of adversity, a lesson that resonates across generations and disciplines. Her story reminds us that greatness is not defined by a lack of obstacles, but by the ability to overcome them. As we wrap up our exploration of Marie Curie's life, let's remember her not just as a scientific luminary, but as a complex figure who navigated a world that was often hostile to her ambitions. She was a pioneer not just in her field, but in her ability to challenge and redefine the very notion of what a woman could achieve. In a world still grappling with gender disparities in science, her story is as relevant today as it was a century ago. So, as we close the book on Marie Curie's extraordinary journey, let's take a moment to appreciate the indelible mark she left on the world. Her legacy is not just in the discoveries she made, but in the barriers she broke, the paths she paved, and the inspiration she continues to provide. Marie Curie was more than just a scientist. She was a force of nature who changed the course of history, one atom at a time.